Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
After returning to the Tower of Dusk, the archmages lowered their heads and began surging towards the legendary realm. In no time, there would probably be a large batch of legendary mages in the Tower of Dusk. By then, the Tower of Dusk would probably become a true magic land in the breezy plains. Finally, it was the day of the meeting held by the Tower of Dusk, which would determine the fate of countless forces of various sizes in the breezy plains. After verifying the authenticity of Lin Li's advancement to the sanctuary realm, and the intriguing relationship he seemed to have with the Ashen Warlock, no individual or force dared to question the authority of the notice. On this day, the leaders of the large and medium-sized forces, including the Mithril Alliance, Caesar family, Blood Moon clan, and the Glitter Gold Trade Union, were all gathered at the Tower of Dusk. As for the smaller forces, the meeting wouldn't affect them much, as they would just be surrendering their benefits to a different person at most. Although the Tower of Dusk had been established for a short period of time, there were more and more people who joined the Tower of Dusk, and they were not just mages, but also talents in other fields, such as technicians from forging workshops. It was impossible to arrange for all of them to live in the Tower of Dusk. Hence, the Tower of Dusk was no longer just a tower that stood by itself in Dewland. It had developed to the point where it was like a city. There were residences for mages to live and study in, forging workshops where magical weapons were constantly imported, and trading places for various products. However, they still couldn't afford a meeting place that could accommodate such a large number of people for now. After all, the Tower of Dusk wouldn't hold large-scale meetings that often, as everything could be decided by the 10-odd senior executives. There was no need to build a conference venue on purpose. Hence, this time, except for a few top forces, the leaders of all the other forces were arranged to wait in an open-air plaza for the meeting to take place. However, no one dared to show the slightest dissatisfaction with the arrangements made by the Tower of Dusk, and their current mood was actually similar to that of a criminal waiting to be sentenced. They were all thinking about what their fate would be in the future. No one cared about the details at all. The leaders of several top forces, as well as those who had long cooperated with the Tower of Dusk, such as Master William of the Time Consignment Store, and Master Cheyenne of the Manhwa family, were first invited to the Tower of Dusk. Hoffman and the longtime partners of the Tower of Dusk were naturally at ease and behaving normally. However, Joseph and Claus looked rather anxious and uneasy. Although Lin Li hadn't done anything to the two forces when they left the Gargus Canyon, that didn't mean that the scores were settled. In their opinion, Lin Li would definitely hold the past against them. In fact, regarding that issue, the leaders of the various forces in the square outside were also making conjectures. Back then, the Mithril Alliance took the lead, and various forces jointly suppressed and boycotted the Tower of Dusk. That was a matter of fact that was known to everyone in the breezy plains. At this moment, everyone watched as Joseph and Claus were led into the Tower of Dusk with sullen expressions. Some were frightened, while some were waiting to see the two become laughingstocks. However, when Lin Li led Joseph and the others out of the Tower of Dusk, Joseph and Claus were somewhat relieved, even though they were not overjoyed. That was a surprise to the people outside. It was completely silent on the plaza, and everyone was quietly waiting for Lin Li to speak, and waiting to hear the verdict that might change their fate. In fact, the Tower of Dusk's unification of the forces of the breezy plains was something that people took for granted as Lin Li, who had already been powerful enough, actually stepped into the sanctuary realm. He also had an unusual relationship with the Ashen Warlock. If they were in his place, they would definitely do the same too. However, those who had yet to enter the sanctuary realm were on a completely different level from the sanctuary powerhouse. How could they guess what the sanctuary powerhouse was thinking? Actually, Lin Li didn't have that much to say, and he managed to get straight to the point of the meeting with just a few words, and that was to have all the forces submit to the Tower of Dusk. In fact, he just wanted to further establish the authority of the Tower of Dusk in the breezy plains. Submission was still fundamentally different from unification, at least for the interests of the various forces, as the Tower of Dusk wouldn't bother to touch them. Commercial operations were another matter. The Tower of Dusk did not place much emphasis on territory. As Lin Li entered the sanctuary realm, the Tower of Dusk was bound to become the magic land of the breezy plains, and mages of all levels would definitely be attracted to it. Hence, Lin Li had no intention of expanding his territory. After hearing it straight from the horse's mouth, the crowd below felt like they were dreaming, as they had initially thought that they might lose everything and have to say goodbye to the authority and prestige they enjoyed. However, in the end, they realized that things hadn't become as terrible as they thought. Submitting to the Tower of Dusk was nothing too unacceptable. After all, the other party was a strong sanctuary powerhouse, and it wouldn't be embarrassing to do so. Other than that, there was no difference from before. Of course, they definitely couldn't provoke anyone from the Tower of Dusk, not even a trivial mage apprentice. Since reality wasn't as bad as they'd imagined it to be, they accepted it much quicker. Things definitely weren't as terrible as they'd expected. To them, submission to Lin Li was far better, and was simply tantamount to a bestowal of a gift as opposed to losing everything like they'd imagined. Of course, submission wasn't simply a matter of speech. The parties would still have to be bound by a contract and subject to laws. However, those matters were reserved for after the meeting. Seeing that no one expressed any objections, Lin Li directly announced the end of the meeting, and stated that those who were willing could proceed to sign the contract, and those who were unwilling. However, at this moment, an exclamation that was full of resentment sounded amongst the crowd. What if I'm unwilling? It would be hard to find out who the person who said that was, since it sounded out of nowhere, but no one in the right mind would be willing to go against a sanctuary powerhouse. Hence, as soon as they heard the exclamation, everyone in the crowd ran and made space to reveal the person who said those words. However, that person did not panic even though he had been exposed. In fact, there was a bit of madness on his face, as if he was looking at his archenemy. He gritted his teeth and stared at Lin Li, who was standing on the platform, before ruthlessly saying, "Masterful, congratulations on stepping into the sanctuary realm and unifying the breezy plains. I have specially brought you a gift today. I hope you'll like it, Masterful." Upon hearing that person's words, there was once again a strange sound in the square, followed by gasps and exclamations of the crowd. Several people who were originally wearing black magic robes, like others, suddenly tore their robes apart to reveal their bodies that were made of metal. They were alchemy puppets in disguise. Actually, those alchemy puppets didn't seem too intricate in structure, but what was truly frightening was that they each had a legendary magical crystal embedded in their chests, and the crystals were emitting a strange ray of red light under the constant stimulation of some alchemy array. An absolutely horrifying mana wave overwhelmed everyone. This was what caused the crowd to panic, as anyone with some knowledge would know that it was the precursor to the eruption of magical crystals. The power that would erupt from a legendary magical crystal was far beyond comparison to an ordinary magical crystal's power. The might of every legendary magical crystal launched by a magical crystal cannon was at legendary level, but each legendary magical crystal could allow a magical crystal cannon to launch hundreds of attacks in a row. Clearly, the power contained in a legendary magic crystal was massive. It could be said that a level 20 legendary magical crystal would not be inferior to a level 24 legendary magic spell if all of its power was released. However, it would not be easy to make a legendary magical crystal explode, and there were more important uses for the valuable legendary magical crystals. Usually, no one would be willing to use a legendary magical crystal as a disposable magic bomb. However, they had no idea how much hatred that person had for the Tower of Dusk. There were 6 similar alchemy puppets in the entire plaza, and the power that might erupt from the 6 legendary magical crystals would be enough to wipe out the entire place. As for the leaders of the various forces, they would definitely have a hard time escaping their doom even if there were some legendary powerhouses among them. "It's Albert, he's really here," exclaimed Cheyenne from the Manhwa family, who immediately recognized the other party's identity as soon as he saw him. Albert was the leader of the Dark Blade, and the son of the leader Lansdale. Back when the Dark Blade had attacked the Tower of Dusk, Borg and Baldella, the 2 legendary leaders, were crippled by Lin Li, and with the loss of those elites, the Dark Blade directly became a second-tier force. The Manhwa family rubbed salt into their wound by besieging the Dark Blade and robbing them of their territory. Now, the Dark Blade, which used to be a top band of bandits, could be considered to have been completely removed from the breezy plains. However, in the process of hunting down the remaining members, the Manhwa family missed Albert, who was an assassin and the leader of the Dark Blade, as well as several other elite assassins who were level 15 or higher. The reality had proven that it was a grave mistake of theirs. Those several elite assassins had caused great trouble in the process of the Manhwa family acquiring the Dark Blade's territory. Fortunately, the Manhwa family was supported by the legendary mage Cheyenne, after all, and after a series of arrangements, they had set up many traps. They even went as far as using their heir, Hutton, as a bait on several occasions to trap those several elite assassins one by one. However, as the elite assassins died, Albert vanished without a trace. A level 19 assassin would be a great threat even to a legendary powerhouse. Although it was embarrassing, the Manhwa family nonetheless informed the Tower of Dusk about it, since they were partners. After all, the Tower of Dusk could be considered to be the main party that had led to the destruction of the Dark Blade. Lin Li informed the various forces of the time of the meeting a month in advance so that they could make preparations. After all, some of them were very far away from the Tower of Dusk. Another reason was to give the hidden enemy a chance to appear. For a sanctuary mage, even a legendary level assassin wouldn't be able to pose any threat to him, let alone a level 19 assassin. This time, if the Tower of Dusk were to successfully unify all the forces of the breezy plains, there would be no room for the enemy anymore. Hence, at this moment, the enemy only had two options. He could either retaliate no matter the cost, or give up completely from then on and find a place to hide for the rest of his life. The fact that the other party chose to take action against the leaders of the forces in order to affect the reputation of the Tower of Dusk was not beyond Lin Li's expectations. However, to Lin Li's surprise, the other party had a high capital this time, and he was clearly prepared to attack the Tower of Dusk all the way. The 6 alchemy puppets should have been purchased from Rotterdam, the alchemy nation. Although they seemed rather poorly made to Lin Li, they should have been worth quite a lot. Besides, the 6 legendary magical crystals were considered a huge fortune to the average person. Unfortunately, Albert had clearly underestimated the strength of the Tower of Dusk and the power of a sanctuary powerhouse. If it had happened before Lin Li entered the sanctuary realm, the 6 self-destructing alchemy puppets might indeed have kept Lin Li busy for a while. However, Lin Li now only needed the power of the debris of the stars, nothingness, to send the alchemy puppets into the chaos of spacetime. Regardless of how powerful they were, it would be useless. I know that this can't hurt you, either, but you can't stop the deaths of these cowards. You can't protect anyone. Haha, Albert exclaimed. He resented Lin Li to the core, and although he knew that he couldn't cause any substantial damage to Lin Li, his being able to hurt the leaders of those various forces and destroy the buildings of the Tower of Dusk was bound to be a great blow to their prestige as well. At this point, the leaders of the various forces were losing their minds, and everyone got into a huge uproar. They all wanted to leave the area as soon as possible. If that were to go on, the meeting would become chaotic, and Lin Li certainly wouldn't allow that to happen. He reached out to grab the debris of the stars, nothingness, and planned to send the 6 self-destructing alchemy puppets to the spacetime chaos. However, at this moment, a patch of space in the air suddenly warped, resembling ripples on the surface of water. Next, an old mage who was dressed in a black robe and had white hair strode out of the warp space. Seeing the chaos in the plaza, the old mage frowned slightly and waved his hand casually while moving towards Lin Li in midair. With a mere wave of his hand, he managed to cause drastic changes in the plaza. The legendary magical crystals that were fluctuating greatly seemed to have been doused with a pot of cold water, as the mana fluctuations disappeared without a trace. At the same time, the self-exploding alchemy puppets, too, crumbled like sand sculptures that had lost their cohesion and scattered all over the ground after turning into tiny particles. The sudden change left everyone stunned, and Albert, who was laughing maniacally, seemed to have choked all of a sudden. Magical crystals were one of the most stable mana aggregates. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been any magical beasts in the world. The legendary magical crystals contained a wisp of non-magical power that was even more difficult to be triggered by an explosion. But once it was successfully triggered, the process would simply be irreversible unless one had godly power. That was the reason Albert chose that method of revenge. That was arguably the most foolproof method of retaliation that he could think of. However, the old mage had merely waved his hand. In fact, the people didn't feel any abnormal magical waves at all. Yet the 6 legendary magical crystals that were about to bring a devastating disaster to everyone as they had already begun releasing their enormous mana stopped silently. Even the leaders of the forces who had panicked and were feeling hopeless just now were in shock and disbelief. What more, Albert? They even forgot to feel the joy of surviving an ordeal. They believed that if the legendary magical crystals were to erupt, they would definitely not cause any damage to Lin Li, the sanctuary powerhouse. In fact, he might even protect the people around him. However, resisting the power that emanated from the erupting legendary magical crystals was different from obliterating it. It would not be an exaggeration to call the old mage's casual actions a miracle. Everyone immediately shifted their gazes to the mage, who had moved through the void, only to be even more shocked because the appearance of the mage actually reminded them of a famous figure from legends. After thinking about the godly power that the other party had displayed, they got rid of the last bit of uncertainty within them. Seeing that the old mage had resolved the crisis with a wave of his hand, Lin Li was rather astonished as well. As a sanctuary powerhouse, he could definitely sense the sanctuary-level aura of the other party. However, the old mage's realm was still far above his, because the old mage was an elite, a top sanctuary powerhouse. Upon sight of the old mage's meticulously combed silver hair, glistening eyes, neatly trimmed silvery white beard, and the natural elegance he exuded as he stepped slowly in the air, Lin Li could easily guess the other party's identity even though he had only been in that world for a few years. He was clad in the robe of an arbitrator of the Supreme Council, and he was different from the austere and old-fashioned Megard and Apophis who lacked restraint. He was an old mage who was poised, naturally elegant, and exuded nobility. He was Chris, one of the 3 arbitrators of the Supreme Council, and once a prince. It was said that during the Dark Age, the High Lord Osric's fiefdom included the Felon Kingdom, and a large portion of the Breezy Plains. In the Jurosis region of Felon Kingdom, there was once a small kingdom known as the Garland Kingdom, which Chris the Arbitrator was the former prince of. Unlike Prince Berhir, the High Lord Osric had always resorted to ruthless means. When ruling over the various forces in his territory, he would squeeze them dry and mercilessly exploit them to the very end. Osric claimed that he would rather leave them with no strength to get up than allow them to have the strength to retaliate. Under the cruel rule of Osric, the small kingdom of Garland, which was unable to provide much value to Osric in the first place, was reduced to a miserable state, and the royals were turned into commoners. When Osric began building the Eternal Furnace, he used the entire kingdom of Garland as a bait to lure a powerful ancient wyrm. In the process of capturing the ancient wyrm, the entire Garland kingdom became a battlefield. Be it the ancient wyrm or Osric's magic legion, no one paid attention to the lives of those humans below. During the intense battle, powerful and massive magic spells landed on the ground of Garland Kingdom, incessantly like a terrifying natural disaster. It seemed to have almost overturned the ground of the entire Garland Kingdom. In that disaster, the Garland Kingdom's population was wiped out, and the royal family had it worse. The original royal palace was destroyed, leaving behind only a massive pit that was created with the dragon breath of an ancient wyrm. Back then, Chris, the prince, was negotiating with neighboring countries for food aid after the famine that had occurred in the kingdom before, and thus managed to escape the disaster by fluke. Chris, who rushed back to the capital of the Garland Kingdom, ran into Garesco, who was attracted by the intense battle. After witnessing the amazing power of magic, Chris swore to avenge his parents and nation, and was introduced to the path of practicing magic by Garesco. Discover updated novels on N.O.V.E. Ulbin Co. Unfortunately, by the time Chris stepped into the Sanctuary Realm, and followed Garesco to wage a war against the High Elves to overthrow them, the High Lord Osric had already begun his long slumber in his mausoleum. After the end of the Dark Age, Garesco established the Supreme Council, of which Chris, Megard, and Apophis became the 3 great arbitrators. At the same time, he also established the Jurosis Guild of Magic, and became the first president of the Guild of Magic. Although Lin Li had guessed the identity of the other party, he did not stop feeling shocked. Legend had it that it had been more than a decade since the arbitrator Chris appeared in the Supreme Council. He had even missed the numerous Supreme Council meetings previously. Hence, there had been rumors about his death and departure from Anral because he had followed in Garesco's footsteps. Hence, many misunderstood the reason for the conflict between Anduin and Rosen to be the vacant position of arbitrator that resulted from Chris' absence. After all, in the Supreme Council, Anduin and Rosen were the only underlings of the 3 arbitrators. From an outsider's perspective, the 2 of them were the most qualified to compete for that position. Now that arbitrator Chris had appeared there, all the rumors were naturally dismissed, and Lin Li could also feel that the sanctuary-level aura of that arbitrator was also much stronger than those of Apophis and Megard. Of course, it was also possible that when Lin Li first met those 2 arbitrators, he had yet to step into the Sanctuary Realm, and thus did not know much about the power of the Sanctuary Realm, which gave birth to such a misconception. However, no matter what, Lin Li was certain that the other party had to be many times stronger than himself. Arbitrator Chris' arrival had allowed the crisis to be resolved, and the issues that were supposed to be addressed during the meeting had also been resolved a long time ago. Hence, with Lin Li's sign, the meeting ended, and the members of the Tower of Dusk led the shocked leaders of the various forces, and proceeded to sign the contract expressing their submission. As for Albert, he definitely faced a terrible end. Lin Li, on the other hand, led the senior executives of the Tower of Dusk and the leaders of several top forces to the sky to wait for the arrival of arbitrator Chris. Chris slowly stepped down from the air, and first looked at Lin Li with a genial smile. He then nodded slightly, and said in a tone of admiration, "Flick, not bad. Respected arbitrator, I didn't know you would descend at the Tower of Dusk, so I didn't arrange anyone to receive you. Please forgive me." While speaking, the people behind Lin Li bowed respectfully to Chris. Although all the leaders of the top forces of the Breezy Plains did not have a unified relationship with the Supreme Council, no one dared to show the slightest disrespect to the arbitrator of the Supreme Council, who was a mythical figure that made them feel uncontrollably excited. In fact, they even found the opportunity to salute him in person to be a supreme honor. Chris waved his hand, indicating that there was no need for them to bow and salute. He teasingly said to Lin Li, "I heard from Apophis that you were never that uptight about rules initially. Why have you learned to become so proper after being a president for a few years? When Lin Li was inaugurated as the president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, arbitrator Apophis had personally attended and given Lin Li some pointers about magic. Back then, Lin Li was tormented during their spar, but he burnt Apophis' beard with fire. Since it was the beard of an arbitrator, it wasn't exactly a loss. Hearing Chris mention Apophis, Lin Li touched his nose in embarrassment and smiled awkwardly. Well, it has been a long time since that happened. Lord Apophis' beard should have grown back, right? Huh. When Chris heard those words, he glared at him in surprise and asked, his beard. What's wrong with that bushy beard of his? He didn't mention anything about the beard to me when I arrived. Ha ha ha. Master Chris, it's really too rude of me. How can I stand here and talk? Hurry and come in, please. Upon hearing his words, Lin Li had an ominous hunch. He almost spilled the beans about the embarrassing matter that Apophis had been through. He quickly changed the topic and invited Chris to go to the Tower of Dusk. Although it was just a simple and light-hearted conversation between the two of them, everyone else was overwhelmed with emotion. The arbitrator of the Supreme Council was a figure that truly stood at the pinnacle of Anral. If they were to have a conversation with such a figure, they probably wouldn't even be able to speak in complete sentences, and it even felt like a fantasy for them to watch. Lin Li and Chris walked in front and headed to the Tower of Dusk, while the rest of the crowd followed cautiously behind as they could not help but slow down their breathing. Although it was a great honor for them to meet the arbitrator of the Supreme Council, enjoying it wasn't that relaxing for them. I left Anral for a while due to a trivial issue that I had to handle. I didn't expect to receive such good news upon my return. You've come out of the Jarosis Guild of Magic, and being able to achieve what you have now is a great contribution to the Guild of Magic of Urasis as well. Chris did not hide his appreciation for Lin Li, and looked at Lin Li like he was looking at his own junior. Of course, Lin Li was in fact like his family, as Lin Li's teacher Andoin was from the Jarosis Guild of Magic. Later on, he also joined the trials as a member of the Jarosis Guild of Magic. He then obtained the qualification to establish a Guild of Magic in the Breezy Plains. Chris was the founder of the Jarosis Guild of Magic and the first president of the Guild of Magic. Hence, they were family. However, the people following behind couldn't help but be flabbergasted, because Lin Li had not only stepped into the sanctuary realm, but also gained a backer like the arbitrator. It seemed that the Breezy Plains would really be the oyster of the Tower of Dusk in the future. Putting aside ordinary forces, even the Ashen Warlock might not be able to shake the Tower of Dusk. Besides, the Ashen Warlock seemed to have good chemistry with Lin Li. You flatter me. I was just doing my best to do what I can. Besides, I had the support of the Supreme Council, Lin Li said humbly. Of course it was true. Although the Supreme Council did not give sufficient support during the establishment of the Tower of Dusk, they had given them a status after all, and they did send some people to help with the construction. HMPH, you don't have to speak up for them. They can't hide those tricks from anyone. Now that the Tower of Dusk has developed to such a great scale, let's not bother with them for now. If anyone dares to target you in the future, just inform me. Even if that ancient Wyrm tries to harm the Tower of Dusk, I'd be able to bury it in the Arctic snowfield. Again, Chris said casually, but the meaning of his words was already too obvious. He was obviously expressing his stand as the backer of the Tower of Dusk. The ancient Wyrm that Chris was referring to was obviously the Ice Blast Wyrm Sindera. Although Sindera was also at the peak of the sanctuary realm, Lin Li knew that Chris was definitely not bragging. If it had been before Lin Li stepped into the sanctuary realm, it probably wouldn't have been easy for him to judge if Sindera was stronger than Chris. However, he could tell from Chris' actions that he was really halfway to becoming a god. The power that erupted from 6 legendary magical crystals was indeed nothing for a sanctuary powerhouse, but Chris had almost reversed the world laws and immediately dissipated that massive power. Perhaps even Sindera might not even be able to do it. It was definitely good to have an additional backer, even though Lin Li might not necessarily need Chris' help given his current abilities. Although Chris' voice wasn't very loud, it sounded like thunder to the people at the back. All of a sudden, they couldn't hear anything else, and they did not even know what Lin Li answered. That was outrageous. Back in the Great Gargus Canyon, the Ice Blast Wyrm had already given Lin Li a horned flute, which it claimed could summon it to help Lin Li fight once. Next, Lin Li and the Ashen Warlock reached some understanding that was unknown to all of them. Even though the Ashen Warlock didn't explicitly side with the Tower of Dusk, he was definitely biased towards them. Now, Chris, the arbitrator of the Supreme Council, was at the peak of the sanctuary realm, yet he actually expressed his willingness to be the backer of the Tower of Dusk. That way, no one in the Breezy Plains or Anral would dare to covet the Tower of Dusk's stuff. How could they not be envious? Hoffman and Cheyenne, who had long cooperated with the Tower of Dusk, were definitely envious of Lin Li for gaining a huge backer like Chris for the Tower of Dusk. However, They were much more confident about their future cooperation. In the past, various forces of the Breezy Plains joined forces to attack the Tower of Dusk. However, no one had the courage to do so now. Given their relationship with the Tower of Dusk, they would definitely reap great benefits as long as the Tower of Dusk stood strong. On the other hand, Joseph, Claus, and the others who targeted the Tower of Dusk were feeling anxious even though they had already gotten Lin Li's forgiveness. They were afraid that Lin Li would casually tell Chris about what had happened in the beginning. After seeing their attitudes, even a fool would know how much the arbitrator Chris valued the young president of the Tower of Dusk. If the arbitrator were to hear about what happened in the past and got infuriated, he would be able to destroy them, a so-called top force. With the flick of a finger, everyone arrived in the Tower of Dusk and returned to their respective seats. Lin Li introduced Chris to the leaders of the various forces, but Chris didn't seem to be too interested. Although Chris had an elegant and refined bearing when he spoke to the crowd, everyone knew how to behave, and simply said a few words to him before leaving. After everyone left, Lin Li asked Chris about the purpose of his visit. He was actually a bit confused. Chris' appearance was indeed a little sudden, and it seemed like his agenda was not just to see him, a newly advanced sanctuary mage, who had come from Jurosis. What you have achieved in the Breezy Plains over the past few years is evident to all. The huge development of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic is also a huge contribution to the Supreme Council. Besides, you have also stepped into the Sanctuary realm. Therefore, after a review and discussion in the Supreme Council, we've decided to take you in as a member of the Supreme Council. Chris simply revealed his purpose of visit. A member of the Supreme Council. Is that a little too early, given my current age? Although the Tower of Dusk now had a strong position in the Breezy Plains, and Lin Li had already entered the Sanctuary realm, he was still young. Simply put, it was a matter of seniority, and that was something he could only gain with time. The Supreme Council was not just a generic force, but an organization that was above all other forces, and even the royal family. It was at the pinnacle of power in that world, and only the brilliant shrine could compare to it. To a certain extent, the decisions made by the Supreme Council could even affect the fate of the entire Anral. In the Supreme Council, the three arbitrators who held the highest authority had the power to affirm and negate all decisions. However, they did not directly participate in the management of the Supreme Council, and their subordinates would only hand over major matters to them for the final decision. There were 100-odd members who constituted the management committee of the Supreme Council, all of whom were top-notch mages of Anral. They basically possessed legendary-level abilities, and they were the ones who made most of the decisions for the Supreme Council. The so-called 10 leaders of the Supreme Council were in fact inclusive of the chairman and vice-chairman. The 10 members of the board had greater authority than ordinary members. The current chairman of the Supreme Council was none other than Lin Li's master, Andoin. The deputy chairman was Master Rosen, who didn't get along that well with Lin Li during the exploration of Ozric's mausoleum. That might be the real source of the conflict between Andoin and Rosen rather than the competition for the position of the arbitrator. After all, even if there was really one less arbitrator, they would not have the right to take on that position given their abilities. Upon hearing Lin Li's words, Chris shook his hand and nonchalantly said, "I know what you're worried about. In fact, I'm too embarrassed to offer you a place in the Supreme Council. Given your current abilities, you're definitely qualified to be a leader too. However, your age is indeed an issue. Hence, I reluctantly agreed to let you be a counselor for the time being." "No, it's a great honor for me to become a counselor of the Supreme Council," Lin Li frantically said politely. Lin Li didn't really care about what rights he would enjoy as a counselor. However, having such an identity was akin to having the Supreme Council as his backer. Even though the Supreme Council wouldn't really make a big fuss over a counselor's affairs, the identity of a counselor was still a deterrent in Anral. The Tower of Dusk indeed had an unshakable position in the Breezy Plains. But what about outside of the Breezy Plains? Anral was vast, and apart from the several kingdoms that had been established by humans, there were also kingdoms established by intelligent races like the dwarves, giants, orcs, and many others. The Tower of Dusk did enjoy a good reputation in the Breezy Plains, but it might not be the same in other regions outside the Breezy Plains. It was different for the Supreme Council. Even the Leaden Kingdom, that believed in the Holy Light doctrine, had to treat them with due respect. The other kingdoms established by other intelligent races did not dare to take the Supreme Council lightly, either. Ever since Garesco left, the three of us have been in charge of the Supreme Council for almost 1,000 years, and it's time for there to be some new vitality in the Supreme Council. I hope that you can bring some good changes to the Supreme Council, Chris said while looking at Lin Li with admiration and some hope in his gaze. There seemed to be some meaning in Chris' words, but Lin Li did not think too much of it. Instead, he curiously asked, "In that case, Is there anything that a counselor of the Supreme Council would have to do? Are there any formalities or administrative procedures? I'll get someone to prepare them. Lin Li still remembered when he was inaugurated as the president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic in the past. Even though the Tower of Dusk had just been established, the inauguration ceremony of the president was not shabby or slipshod at all. At that time, there were quite a few people who came to celebrate the event, most of whom were big shots. Of course, they gave quite a few gifts too. If he were to become a counselor of the Supreme Council, would they hold a ceremony and give him some gifts too? Chris seemed to have read Lin Li's mind. He shook his head and said, "There's nothing to prepare. This is an internal matter of the Supreme Council. In 10 days' time, there will be a regular meeting of the Supreme Council, and you have to attend it as a new counselor. We have made arrangements for everything else." Although there was no need to hold a ceremony, and Lin Li would not be receiving any more gifts, he wasn't too disappointed about it. After all, with his current fortune, there was really nothing else he wanted other than a superior treasure like the Stars of Fury. Besides, others might not be able to afford what he wanted. So, where am I supposed to go to attend the meeting in 10 days? Of course, Lin Li knew that the regular meetings of the Supreme Council would naturally be held at the Supreme Council's venue. However, the location of the Supreme Council seemed to have always been a secret in the past 1,000 years or so. "Don't worry, I'll take you there when the time comes," Chris said with a smile. He then looked around curiously and continued, "Shouldn't you take me on a tour around your Tower of Dusk now?" Lin Li naturally would not turn down Chris' request. He had put in plenty of effort into the construction of the Tower of Dusk, and although it might be a little exaggerated to say that it was like his child, it should be right to say that it was his proudest piece of work. To Lin Li, showing the best piece of work he had done to a mythical figure like Chris was still a relatively rewarding thing. The Tower of Dusk had grown to the point where there were more than 1,000 mages, and it was naturally impossible to arrange for all of them to live in the tower. Besides, the Tower of Dusk was different from the other guilds of magic. They were not built in the same city, and the mages recruited were not only from Dueland City, but also from various other regions of the Breezy Plains. It was unlike the Jaros's Guild of Magic where the Emerald Tower was built right in Jaros's city, and the mages each had their own residence in the city. Hence, living quarters had been built in the Tower of Dusk, and the closest to the Tower of Dusk was a relatively independent building with 2 floors and boasting an environment that was rather elegantly decorated, which was specially built for the elite mages. In the periphery outside the mages' residences, there was a curved building that was made up of adjoined 3-story buildings. There were 2 rows of such buildings, and in addition to serving as the living space of the mages, the buildings in the outer radius were similar to city walls and served a defensive purpose. Of course, since it was meant for defense, the materials used to build them were very sturdy even though they weren't tall. Besides, there were magic arrays around them, as well as a large number of mageths. It could be considered a tough defense to break even for legendary magic spells. The residence of the elite mages was enough to accommodate more than 200 mages, and although the living conditions of the ordinary mages were slightly inferior, their residences could accommodate 2,000 mages. If the residences were fully occupied, the power of the Tower of Dusk would definitely reach an astonishing level. However, as Lin Li entered the sanctuary realm, and the Tower of Dusk became the magic land of the Breezy Plains, there would definitely be mages from all areas who would apply to join them. At that time, they might even have to expand the Tower of Dusk. Of course, it wouldn't be troublesome, as he just had to add another round of buildings to the outermost periphery. In fact, Lin Li had taken some inspiration from the Sky Castle when he designed the entire architectural layout of the Tower of Dusk. However, he didn't have to set up conquering mageths, hence, it didn't seem like a maze. In addition, among the various residential areas, there were several libraries that were specially set up, and they contained magic books of varying depth of content. The mages did not have to deliberately study in the Tower of Dusk. The books contained core magical knowledge, and only the elite mages or the ones who had received permission from the higher-ups would be allowed to enter to study. The area opposite the residences of the mages was the buildings of the Tower of Dusk's businesses, and the forging workshop took up the largest amount of space. It was also the residence of the blacksmiths and other talents. Chris was originally not too interested in the forging workshop, since they just housed some blacksmiths who would hammer and forge metals. However, when Lin Li brought him into one of the forging workshops, he couldn't help but get a great shock. It turned out that the forging workshop was not filled with blacksmiths, but with alchemical machines with complex structures. Was this created by the goblin Angelano? Chris had lived for so many years, but it was really the first time he had seen such a sight. There was a row of hammers on the alchemical machines that were lifted and dropped neatly. After being struck a certain number of times, there would be a mechanical lever replacing the billet with a new one before the striking resumed. The ones that were replaced would be processed separately in bulk. Goblins were short in stature and lacked mana and power. How could they build such massive alchemy colossuses? With their power, they probably could not even raise the hammers used by blacksmiths. How did they break the metal into the parts they wanted? They managed to do so by relying on their mastery of the alchemical machines, and used the power of the machinery to accomplish things they couldn't do themselves. Lin Li sometimes even wondered if the world would have become like the one he was in before he transmigrated if the goblins had not perished, and instead dominated Anra like the high elves had. Of course, alchemy machinery was not omnipotent. The machines in the forging workshop only provided the preliminary processing of metal, and the true creation of magical weapons would still have to be done by the blacksmiths. The significance of the existence of the alchemy machinery was to provide more secrecy for the techniques, and also to reduce the workload of the blacksmiths to a certain extent. The mainstay business of the Tower of Dusk were the forging industry and the pharmaceutical industry. However, although the forging workshop was placed outside, the preparation of potions was still carried out in the tower. Wilkinson and the other pharmacists resided in the tower as well. After all, the pharmacists were of higher value than the blacksmiths, and Lin Li had to exercise a stricter system of secrecy for the pharmaceutical formulas. However, with the rise in the Tower of Dusk's status, and Lin Li's entry to the sanctuary realm, he believed that no one would dare to harbor any thoughts about the pharmacists even if the process of formulating potions was done outside the tower. After taking a tour around the buildings around the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li did not take Chris back to the Tower of Dusk immediately, and instead took him to the back of the Tower of Dusk where there was an elegant garden-like environment. There were some trees and flowers there, but in the middle, there was a young seedling with only 2 tender leaves, which surprised Chris. "I didn't expect that you've already revived the Seed of Eternity." Chris could not help but be amazed with the weak seedling when he looked at it and sensed its vibrant aura that was full of vitality. Lin Li had obtained a dead Seed of Eternity from the Sky Castle, and that matter was basically not a secret anymore. Since the Supreme Council decided to make him a member of the council, they had naturally gotten a good understanding of the matter. However, the revival of the Seed of Eternity was accidentally performed in the Great Rift of the Eternal Darkness Altar during the battle with the Flame Dragon Lothar. Hence, it was not something that ordinary people could understand. The Tree of Eternity had given birth to the High Elves, who had ruled Anral, and also maintained the balance of the world laws of Anral. Hence, it was called the World Tree. The power and value of the Tree of Eternity were beyond those of any artifacts or treasures. Hence, after reviving the Tree of Eternity, Lin Li did not immediately plant it. Instead, he waited until he entered the Sanctuary Realm. The current Tree of Eternity was still just a young sapling, and all of its power was utilized for its growth. It did not emit a strong aura of life. Otherwise, Chris would have already discovered its presence as soon as he arrived. Besides, Lin Li had also arranged some maggots around the sapling. One was to prevent the aura of life from leaking, while the other was to protect it from being trampled. The seedling that had only 2 tender leaves looked inconspicuous, but the benefits that it would bring to the Tower of Dusk after it grew up were absolutely unimaginable. One of the most direct benefits was that the talent of the mages would be increased greatly after bathing in the power of the Tree of Eternity. That was different from improving one's strength, as talent was usually determined at birth and could not be changed by external forces at all. If one was destined to only be at the level of an archmage, it would be impossible for them to step into the legendary realm regardless of how hard they worked. For example, Jarian had reached the maximum of his magical talent at the peak of level 19, and despite being given the help of the various superior conditions of the Tower of Dusk, he was never able to take that last step to cross the threshold. If Jarian's body could be baptized by the power of the Tree of Eternity, his magical talent would gradually be increased. Once his talent reached the standard required for the legendary realm, it would only be right for him to enter the legendary realm. Of course, Lin Li did not know when the Tree of Eternity would grow. After all, it was not an ordinary tree, and God knew how long its growth cycle was. It was possible for it to be 100-200 years, or even 1,000-2,000 years. After talking to Chris about the Tree of Eternity, Lin Li took him back to the Tower of Dusk, and introduced some of the settings in the Tower of Dusk to him, such as the all-kill array and so on. Finally, Lin Li brought Chris to the top of the Tower of Dusk where the massive Eternal Furnace was placed. The Eternal Furnace was not considered a secret, but Lin Li did not activate the Ice and Fire Nature magical domain. It was not that he didn't trust Chris, but rather that it involved the debris of the stars, polar snow and raging flames. Hence, it would be difficult to explain. After Chris visiting the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li had about 10 days to prepare for the regular meeting of the Supreme Council. However, He did not waste any time at all. He asked Chris about some of his experience in the Sanctuary Realm, and also found out about some history of the Supreme Council during the Dark Age. Although Lin Li had the Book of Eternity that contained Garesco's experiences in the Sanctuary Realm, there was still a difference between what was written and what was taught in real life. Besides, everyone had their own opinion about the mastery and control of Sanctuary Realm power. After all, not everyone had chosen the same path. Chris had taken a liking to Lin Li, hence, he would answer Lin Li's questions without reservations. He was also very serious about passing on the valuable experience he had gained in the Sanctuary Realm to Lin Li. The fact that Chris could stand on the pinnacle of the Sanctuary Realm meant that he had chosen the path to the highest point, even though it was slightly different from the one chosen by Garesco, the god of mages. Hence, any bit of experience he had gained along the way was of great value even to Lin Li, who possessed the Book of Eternity. 10 days passed by in the blink of an eye, and Lin Li managed to learn a lot from arbitrator Chris. Although he could not advance to level 26 immediately, his realm had become much more stable and solid. He also gained a clearer understanding of the power of the Sanctuary Realm. In terms of power, he could not change much in 10 days, but Lin Li could sense a huge increase in his combat power. It was finally the day of the regular meeting of the Supreme Council. Lin Li followed Chris out of the Tower of Dusk, and after taking 2 steps, Chris stopped in his tracks. While Lin Li was feeling puzzled, Chris lowered his head and began chanting some simple and short incantations. As he was doing so, the space in front of them suddenly fluctuated and became a little warped like a ripple. A magical door with a soft glow appeared out of nowhere. "Let's go," Chris said to Lin Li as he turned around before stepping into the door, causing ripples to form like a stone falling into water. Seeing Chris' figure disappearing in the magical door, Lin Li followed suit without hesitation and soon vanished. When entering, Lin Li subconsciously closed his eyes, but when he opened them again, he was greeted by an entirely different scenery. The sight in front of Lin Li felt somewhat familiar to him, and he seemed to have seen a hint of the Tower of Dusk from it. It seemed to be a city, but the rows of buildings didn't look very neat. However, they seemed to also have been staggered in a certain pattern. The roads between the buildings weren't straight, but had seemingly irregular twists and turns. Lin Li shifted his gaze to the edge of the city, but he suddenly discovered that there was a sea of surging clouds outside. He thought, is this city a sky castle, and not a city that was built on land? This is the venue of the Supreme Council. We call it the Sky Garden. Chris didn't rush Lin Li, and simply introduced the place to him smilingly. The Sky Garden? Sky. Lin Li finally remembered why the place seemed to resemble the Tower of Dusk. It was because he had designed the Tower of Dusk based on the layout of the Sky Castle. The environmental layout of the Sky Garden was clearly also related to that of the Sky Castle. However, Lin Li remembered that in the legendary war, at the end of the Dark Age, Garesco led his rebellion forces to consecutively destroy 6 sky castles of the High Elves, leaving one intact because it had escaped into the Spacetime Rift. The last sky castle had already been sent away by Lin Li through the Ga mountain range's teleportation array. It was now occupied by the powerful ghost and countless undead creatures. In that case, was the Sky Garden in front of him built by the Supreme Council based on the Sky Castle? If that was the case, the fear that Lin Li had for the power of the Sky Castle would increase greatly. Ever since the Dark Age, there were not many people who wanted to replicate a Sky Castle, but some had only drawn up theories, while others had put their plans in motion. For example, the High Lord Osric built the Eternal Furnace based on the Sky Castles. However, the end product was still largely different from the real Sky Castles. There was also the Church of Dawn that the Pope of the Brilliant Shrine resided in. Although it was located on the Holy Mountain, it actually had the ability to fly through the air. However, it was worlds apart from the Sky Castles. The Eternal Darkness Altar of the Darkness Shrine was in fact just an item that resembled the Sky Castles, but the Darkness Shrine suffered a series of catastrophes, and the construction of the altar was postponed. Lin Li knew that the Supreme Council had a Sky Tower that once appeared when the Shadowglen suppressed the entry to Osric's mausoleum. In all aspects, it was highly similar to the Eternal Furnace, but it was still far from the Sky Castles. At that time, Lin Li felt that the Sky Tower might have been a replica of the Sky Castles created by the Supreme Council. However, after looking at the place known as the Sky Garden, Lin Li secretly compared it to the Sky Castle in his memory, only to discover that he couldn't even tell which was better or worse for a moment. Is this the place of the Supreme Council? Lin Li asked, seemingly subconsciously as he was in shock. Yes, it's here, the Sky Garden that floats above Enril. Apart from some counselors who reside here, most of the occupants are descendants of the mages who were involved in the war and are now mages of the Supreme Council. Chris was not surprised by Lin Li's reaction. In fact, every mage who visited the Sky Garden for the first time had a similar expression as Lin Li. Lin Li slightly restrained his feelings of excitement and turned to say to Chris, "This sky garden was built using the High Elves' sky castle as a template, right? I always thought that the sky castles could not be replicated, but the Supreme Council actually managed to do so long ago. Although the 6 sky castles that had fallen during the war at the end of the Dark Age definitely left behind a large amount of wreckage that could be salvaged for construction, they would still require excellent techniques in every occupation in order to build a sky castle again. In the era where a large amount of technology was lost, that meant that the conditions would be nearly impossible to fulfill. That was the reason for Lin Li's shock, not the majesty and grandeur of the sky garden." Hearing Lin Li's question, Chris also understood that Lin Li's shock was because he disagreed. Hence, he said with some amusement, "No, I think you think so because of those legends. They all say that during the war, the commander of the rebellion forces, Garesco, led them to destroy the 6 sky castles of the High Elves. Actually, that legend isn't real." "What?" Lin Li couldn't help but look surprised again. This legend could not really be considered a legend, but a true historical record. In reality, after the war ended, everyone did find the traces of the 6 sky castles' wreckage in several major battlefields on the continent. Also, there was a split in the alliance that arose because of the distribution of the wealth plundered from the wreckage of the sky castles. One of those 7 sky castles was built by the High Elves, but they did not get involved in the war at all, and of the 6 sky castles that were actually involved in the war, actually 5 were destroyed and the remaining one was captured entirely intact by Garesco. It was obviously the sky garden in front of him that had been captured. When Chris was touring the city with Lin Li, he talked to him about the war back then, and the origins of the sky garden. As they toured the sky garden, Lin Li could gradually tell there were shadows of the sky castle. For example, the usage of materials, the basic structure of the building, and so on. However, the entire sky garden looked very different from the sky castles, and had obviously undergone a great transformation. When the immortal king built the sky castles, they were designed with high elves in mind. Now, people were using the sky castle. Although humans could use it directly, there would definitely be various inconveniences during the process. Lin Li could tell that it was modified to the extent that a human could control it. The sky castle that had escaped into the space-time rift was said to be the most powerful of the 7 sky castles. After studying the information about the other 6 sky castles, he could basically confirm that. However, after being modified by Garesco, the god of mages, and adding the gradual improvement of the Supreme Council over the past 1,000 years, it was no longer inferior to the 7th sky castle. In fact, the 7th sky castle's power mainly came from its power system. It had been drifting in the space-time rift for thousands of years, and endured the overwhelming void storm for thousands of years, yet its defensive abilities had not weakened in the slightest, proving the massive strength of the power system. After exploring and hearing Chris' introduction, Lin Li knew that the various perfect facilities in it were also incomparable to the 7th sky castles. However, while its power system could not compare to the 7th sky castles, its facilities and advantage of being completely suitable for being controlled by the human mages was enough to close the gap between the two. However, the canopy of the city was not activated in the sky garden, perhaps because they wanted to save power. The environment in the city was the same as the outside environment at high altitude, but the extremely low air pressure and the rampant magical turbulences were lethal to mages below the level of Archmage. Hence, along the way with Chris, Lin Li saw that the streets of the sky garden were rather empty and deserted. He could occasionally see a few mages hurrying here and there. Of course, the mages were at least level 15 and above. Mages lower than that would basically be courting death by staying there. While introducing the sky garden to Lin Li patiently, Chris led Lin Li to the central area of the sky garden, where a tower with a somewhat strange shape was erected. It was eye-catching, and even looked somewhat awkward compared to the architectural style of the surrounding environment. The tower was constructed with materials that Lin Li had never seen before. They were not magical metals or special cement. Instead, they seemed like wood, and there were wood patterns, which seemed to have contained some laws, forming a natural mageth with terrifying power. This central tower was built by Garesco using half of the Tree of Eternity. Hence, it's known as the Eternal Tower. Although it has already lost its life, the power it contains is still incomparable to any material. Central Tower could tell that there was some doubt in Lin Li's eyes. Hence, he smiled and revealed the answer before Lin Li asked. Upon hearing his answer, Lin Li secretly wiped his sweat and thought to himself that Garesco really could think of anything. He actually thought of using half of the Tree of Eternity to build a tower. He could imagine that the mages in the tower would probably be able to experience an increase in strength that would be greater than the effects of meditation, without even having to do anything. Lin Li also understood the reason for the strange shape of the tower. The branches that extended out from the top of the tower were obviously the sturdy branches that were left over from the half of the Tree of Eternity. Now, there were windows in the branches which had obviously been transformed into multi-purpose rooms. At this moment, the square in front of the tower was no longer as deserted as the streets, and there were numerous mages who were walking towards it from all directions. Some walked straight into the tower, while some who were smarter walked over to greet Chris. Of course, they made various speculations about Lin Li, who appeared beside Chris when they returned. After Chris responded to the few mages who greeted him, he brought Lin Li to the Eternal Tower. The Eternal Tower covered a large area, and the hall that they entered after passing through the gate was like a spacious square. The rooms on both sides of the hall were rather roomy too. The mages who were there were either chatting in the hall, or gathering in groups for discussions in the side halls. Usually, those who held discussions in the side halls did not want to be disturbed. Hence, most mages wouldn't enter the halls out of courtesy, unless they knew the people inside. After walking into the hall with Lin Li, Chris only stopped for a while before leading Lin Li to another side hall. Upon seeing the people there, Lin Li immediately understood what Chris was thinking. The two people who were speaking were Aldwin, the president of the Alana Guild of Magic, and Macklin, who had advanced to the legendary realm. Lin Li wasn't surprised to see the two of them. As the president of the Guild of Magic, Aldwin was definitely a counselor as well. On the other hand, Macklin had successfully stepped into the legendary realm when exploring Osric's mausoleum. With the contribution that he had made to the Supreme Council during the exploration, it was only logical that he would become a counselor. Besides, the two of them were probably not ordinary counselors. At least, Aldwin was definitely qualified to become a high counselor. Seeing that arbitrator Chris was leading Lin Li into the side hall, Aldwin and Macklin who were chatting were stunned, but quickly reacted and greeted Chris. Yes, Chris answered. He nodded in response to their greetings. He turned around and smilingly said to Lin Li, "You guys are considered acquaintances, so go ahead and talk here for a while. I have some things to handle, so I won't accompany you further." Before Lin Li could respond to Chris' words, Aldwin and Macklin got a great shock. It turned out that arbitrator Chris had specially brought Lin Li there because he was afraid that Lin Li would be bored after he left. An arbitrator was the most authoritative figure of the Supreme Council, yet Chris valued Lin Li to the extent that he cared about his feelings. No one else in the Supreme Council would receive such treatment, not even the counselors Andoin and Rosen. After sending the arbitrator Chris away, Lin Li, Aldwin, and Macklin returned to their seats in the side hall. Lin Li saw that the two of them still didn't seem to have recovered from their shock. Hence, he smilingly said, "Masters, it's been some time since we met during the last cooperation." "Oh, yes, it's been quite a few days," Macklin subconsciously answered before recovering from the shock abruptly. He frantically asked Lin Li, "Why did you come over together with arbitrator Chris? Didn't they say that the Supreme Council is calling for a regular meeting? I've never been to the Sky Garden before, so arbitrator Chris brought me here." Lin Li explained simply. He did not go into detail about the matter of Chris looking for him at the Tower of Dusk. However, even if Lin Li didn't go into detail, Aldwin and Macklin were not fools, and they could somewhat guess something. Since Chris was the one who brought Lin Li there, he had to have gone to look for Lin Li previously. Lin Li had already mentioned the regular Supreme Council meeting. Hence, there was no need for them to guess at all. He was definitely at least a counselor. "Flick, now that I think about it, it's only been a short period of time since you joined the magic trials. I didn't expect you to have already stepped into the next realm. Compared to you, I really feel like I've lived my life in vain." Aldwin initially did not believe it when he heard the rumors of Lin Li entering the sanctuary realm. He refused to believe such an exaggerated matter of a mage entering the sanctuary realm in his 20s, even though he was extremely optimistic about his magical talent. However, after seeing arbitrator Chris' attitude towards Lin Li, and sensing Lin Li's aura that was similar to Chris, Aldwin finally had an answer. That answer made him feel shocked and a little dejected, but he was mostly genuinely impressed with Lin Li's talent. Macklin had only entered the legendary realm when exploring Osric's mausoleum. Although it had been a while since then, that amount of time was still not enough for a breakthrough for ordinary people. Hence, he was only at the peak of level 20. Macklin didn't sense the sanctuary level aura of Lin Li's body that clearly. Hence, Aldwin's words made him feel a little puzzled. He asked President, "What did you say?" He made it through the threshold. "Hasn't this kid Flick entered the legendary realm a long time ago already?" "What's after the legendary realm?" Aldwin asked, shaking his head with a bitter smile. It had been many years since he entered the legendary realm, but the sanctuary realm still seemed ethereal. He had no idea if he would have the chance to enter it in his lifetime. He felt that Lin Li wasn't human at all. Even the high elves who claimed to be the most intelligent and outstanding race would not advance at such a rapid speed. Above the legendary realm, sanctuary realm? No way, Fulik. Did you really step into the sanctuary realm? Macklin had only stepped into the legendary realm for a short period of time, and perhaps had yet to experience the difficulty of ascending in the legendary realm. Hence, he wasn't as emotional as Aldwin. Lin Li, Aldwin, and Macklin were having a casual chat in the side hall. Although the number of people entering the Eternal Tower increased, no one entered to disturb them. However, that didn't last for too long, as two middle-aged mages walked in not long after, each with a young mage. Visit No. V. 3LB, and CM for Nouvelle. The two young mages were Lin Li's acquaintances. They were Mason and Oren, who were his roommates during the magic trials in Alana. After hearing Aldwin's introduction, Lin Li learned that one of the two middle-aged mages was level 19 Archmage Joey, who was the president of Chevan City's Guild of Magic and Mason's teacher. The other was Honor, who was the president of Rotterdam Guild of Magic and Oren's teacher. Joey and Honor were rather puzzled when they first saw Aldwin chatting merrily with a young man from outside. However, after hearing Aldwin introduce Lin Li as the president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, the two of them immediately got rid of their doubts and began chatting with Lin Li enthusiastically. Although Mason and Oren had already found Lin Li's appearance familiar before they entered, they were somewhat unsure for a moment when they saw Lin Li's relaxed demeanor as he was chatting with the president of the Alana Guild of Magic. However, after they entered with their teachers and saw Lin Li, they were already certain that Lin Li was indeed their former roommate. However, since their teachers were right beside them, they couldn't go forward to say anything. The two of them could only stand beside their own teachers, whom they had always been in awe of, and watch them chat with their former roommate. Mason wanted to say something, but he dared not do so. He simply scratched his ear and touched his chin. If it weren't for the fact that his teacher was right beside him, he probably would have gone forward to grab Lin Li immediately and chat with him incessantly. On the other hand, Oren still behaved indifferently and coldly. He remained still while standing beside his teacher, but when he looked at Lin Li, there was still a bit of envy in his eyes. After chatting with the two presidents, Lin Li saw Mason standing behind President Joey, opening and closing his mouth like he was saying something. Besides, he was also secretly reaching his hand out of the hall. Lin Li was also a young man, so he naturally knew what Mason meant. Hence, he bade farewell to Aldwin and the rest, and said that he was going to go catch up with the two of them. However, Aldwin did not let Lin Li leave, and he simply said that he was going to take Joey and Honor out and introduce them to a few of the counselors. Hence, the four of them left the side hall, leaving the three young men behind. With an exaggerated sigh of relief, Mason watched as his teacher left before finding a seat and sitting down. While pounding his thigh, he said to Oren, "Hey, you've been standing for a long time. Aren't you tired?" "I'm exhausted from walking and standing throughout the journey, idiot," Oren chastised. It was his usual remark at Mason, but he nonetheless took a seat on a chair near him. Mason had long gotten used to Oren's remarks. He simply rolled his eyes and said to Lin Li, "Fulik, I heard that you've made the Breezy Plains become rather lively. It seems that there were rumors about you entering the legendary realm. Is that true? Are you coming here to become a counselor too?" Oren didn't eagerly ask a bunch of questions like Mason did, but after hearing Mason's questions, he acted as if he was listening. Clearly, he wanted to ask those questions as well, but his personality prevented him from doing so. "Legendary realm, I guess. This time, I did come over here to attend the regular meeting as a counselor." Lin Li did not hide the matter of him being a counselor. As for the issue regarding power, Mason would definitely take it as a joke if he were to tell them that he had already entered the sanctuary realm. Mason might even guffaw continuously. Although Lin Li merely asked the question, Mason and Oren were filled with envy. However, as his former roommates, they were naturally happy for him too. "Ah, a counselor of the Supreme Council. My teacher has recently become one too. You guys, if I had been able to find a place to become a president, do you think I'd have been able to become a counselor now as well? If that was really the case, I'd be a counselor too, and teacher wouldn't scold me all the time anymore, would he? Ha ha." Mason's words revealed his fondness for fantasizing. He stared at the roof and seemed to have started daydreaming. "Idiot, you're daydreaming again. Given your abilities, you would be reduced to ashes now," Oren said, dampening Mason's spirits like a wet blanket and shattering his dreams. I can at least think about it." Mason sounded rather dejected, but he soon got excited again. He pulled Lin Li and asked about the matters regarding the Breezy Plains. Actually, since the trial, Mason's and Oren's strength had been increasing rather quickly. During the trial, Mason was only a level 9 magic shooter, 1, but now he had already become a level 16 archmage, while Oren was a level 17 archmage. That speed would definitely allow them to be worthy of being called magical geniuses in Anral. 1. Pretty sure magic shooters started somewhere from levels 12-14, but that's what was written. Indeed, both Mason and Oren were treated as magical talents in the Guild of Magic and were nurtured by hopeful teachers. Even Aldwin had said that the two of them were the best of their generation and had high chances of entering the legendary realm. Although the three of them hadn't seen each other for a long time, and there was a gap in their status, they were all young people, after all. There were many topics they could talk about. Lin Li talked to them about the matters of the breezy plains, while Mason and Oren each talked about the experiences they had after the trials. Before they knew it, they had been talking for a long period of time. They're just two pieces of garbage from the countryside, yet they're deemed as magical talents. What a joke, a young blonde-haired mage mocked with disdain, and raised his chin slightly as he entered the side hall, where Lin Li and the rest were in. When he looked at Mason and Oren, there was an icy cold gaze in his narrow eyes. Lin Li wasn't familiar with that young mage, but Mason and Oren had obviously interacted with him before. Mason hostilely retorted, "Geroso, our conversation has nothing to do with you. You called us country bumpkins. You're the one who doesn't know the rules. You still barged in despite seeing that there are people here. Is this what your teacher taught you? It's none of my business, but there are some people who don't know how to keep their voices down even when they're lying. I feel so ashamed for you. You're just garbage, and yet you're deemed magical talents. You even dream of entering the legendary realm. I think you can dream on. You say there are people here." Geroso glanced at Lin Li, but he did not feel any strong magical waves. "Hence," he continued, "I didn't see anyone. I just saw a bunch of garbage." "He's Gryffindor's elder brother," said Oren, explaining the identity of the visitor to Lin Li. However, he did not stop looking at Geroso. He clenched his fist while resting it on the chair, and it seemed that the feud between them wasn't as simple as just a verbal dispute. Initially, Lin Li didn't know what feud there was between them, but after hearing that Geroso was Gryffindor's brother, he suddenly understood all of it. During the trials back then, he used mental disruption to cripple Gryffindor, who was known as the first magical genius of the Felon Kingdom. Later on, he went to the breezy plains, hence, Mason and Oren were blamed for it. Mason stood up fiercely and resentfully retorted, "Geroso, don't think you're a big shot just because you're at level 19. There are plenty of level 19 archmages in this world. Not all of them can become legendary mages. There's no big deal about being at level 19, but as long as I can defeat you two, it's enough, isn't it? Had teacher not stopped me then, HMPH?" Geroso ignored the murderous gazes of Mason and Oren. He walked towards a chair, took a seat, and glanced at Mason before saying, "Yes, indeed, not everyone at level 19 can become a legendary mage. Mason, your teacher has been stuck at level 19 for years, hasn't he? It's no wonder that he can only foster garbage like you." "Geroso, how dare you insult my teacher?" Although Mason often complained about his teacher being too harsh, he wouldn't tolerate others insulting his teacher openly. He immediately took out his staff and was ready to do something, ignoring the fact that Geroso was stronger than him and the place that he was in. Faced with an angry Mason, Geroso didn't panic at all. He looked at Mason with disdain and said, "How can that be considered an insult? I'm just stating facts." Geroso was waiting for Mason to lose control and attack him. Given Mason's ability, he wouldn't be able to hurt him at all. They were in the Eternal Tower of the Supreme Council, and if Mason were to attack him, even his teacher Joey would get into trouble as well. Although it was said that those below the sanctuary realm were like insignificant ants, Lin Li was still very young, unlike the old fogies who had been in the sanctuary realm for thousands of years. Thus, Lin Li could not bring himself to see Mason, Oren, and Jerian as insignificant ants. In fact, be it the three great arbitrators, or High Priest Rog of the Darkness Shrine, they probably had friends who couldn't step into the sanctuary realm when they were younger. However, as their friends left one by one, their hearts truly drifted farther and farther away from mortals. Hence, Lin Li naturally wouldn't watch Mason suffer at this time. He said in a calm tone, "Mason, some things aren't what others say they are. I heard that Master Macklin of the Alana Guild of Magic was also stuck in level 19 for many years, but he stepped into the legendary realm recently. No one can be certain when it comes to the legendary realm. With the narrow-mindedness of some people, I'm afraid that Master Macklin has probably been called garbage by them plenty of times before." Although Lin Li's words would not make Mason ignore Geroso's insult to his teacher, they managed to calm him down a little. He thought about the place he was in, and finally suppressed his anger as he stopped looking at Geroso's annoying face. Seeing that Mason was actually not going to snap, Geroso's face grew gloomy and sullen as he turned to look at Lin Li, whom he had never taken seriously. There was a look of ruthlessness in his eyes. With his own knowledge of Mason, he knew that Mason would have definitely done something to him at all costs. Yet to his surprise, Mason was stopped by the nameless kid. It seemed that they had an extraordinary relationship, seeing that they were somewhat ignoring him and having a conversation instead. Geroso rolled his eyes and sneered. He jibed, "Mason, seems like you're in a good mood. Is it true that the matter of the pirates in Chevan City has been settled? When I go back and see my teacher, I can talk to him about it so that he doesn't have to send people to your side." Mason and Lin Li chatted for a while, and Mason's feelings were gradually placated. However, when he heard Geroso's words, he turned beet red immediately and rebutted, "Geroso, this is our personal feud. If you have what it takes, don't get the guild involved." Mason's Guild of Magic was located in a city near the sea in the southeast of the Felon Kingdom, hence its name, Chevan City Guild of Magic. Although it was not that competent, the deterrence provided by the Supreme Council allowed them to have a high status there, and ordinary forces wouldn't dare to provoke them easily. However, in this world, the steep mountains were often full of bandits that shuttled through the forests. The desert that was known as the Land of Death was full of sand pirates that came and went like the wind. The vast and boundless sea was also a perfect concealment for the pirates even despite its endless dangers. Others feared the Guild of Magic because their property was near, and if things were to go awry during a fallout, no one would benefit. However, the pirates didn't have that concern. As soon as they saw a chance, they would seize it and go on shore to rob. Whenever there was a strong enemy, they would get onto their boats and flee into the endless sea. The sea was their world, and even legendary powerhouses couldn't do anything to them. In comparison, pirates were probably even more fearless than bandits and sand pirates. Lin Li could tell from the conversation between Geroso and Mason that the pirates had set their sights on Chevan City. As the top force of Chevan City, the Guild of Magic definitely needed to do something, otherwise, how could it be acknowledged by the other local forces? However, the strength of the Chevan City Guild of Magic, which was helmed by a president who had yet to even step into the legendary realm, made it hard for them to even defend against the pirates, let alone keep their interests. As for the assistance from the new Crescent City Guild of Magic that Geroso mentioned, it was obviously not going to be of much use either, as it would at most make the pirates a little more worried and lie low for a while. Of course, it could not be ruled out that it might be because the new Crescent City refused to give too much help. In any case, the pirates were still present, and the Chevan City Guild of Magic would still have to continuously seek help from New Crescent City Guild of Magic. Was it really difficult to actually get rid of a bunch of pirates? Seeing that Mason was thwarted by Geroso, who was getting even more smug, Lin Li suddenly broke the stalemate and calmly said, "Mason, why didn't you tell me about this just now? You're not treating me like your friend. They're just a bunch of pirates, aren't they? How about this? When you meet President Joey again, inform him that I'll send you a few magical crystal cannons. Although the power of magical crystal cannons is ordinary, they should be enough for attacking the pirates." Although Lin Li could easily send a large batch of archmages to provide aid with the current strength of the Tower of Dusk, the mages of the breezy plains had never had experience in naval battles, and it was impossible for them to be stationed in Chevan City for a long time. Besides, Lin Li was also considering the feelings of Mason and President Joey. Although the Chevan City Guild of Magic was indeed very weak, sending a batch of archmages there all of a sudden would inevitably make them feel like he was trying to steal their thunder. The magical crystal cannons were different. Regardless of the power of the magical crystal cannons, they were just tools to be used, after all. If he sent them over, the people of the Chevan City Guild of Magic would be the ones using them to eliminate the pirates. That could also increase their reputation in Chevan City. As soon as Lin Li said that, the other three people in the side hall were clearly stunned, and Mason quickly reacted by putting away his staff and returning to his seat. He turned to smile at Lin Li and said, "Is that so? Great. With magical crystal cannons, it'd be too simple to get rid of the pirates. From now on, we'll get rid of people who always go to our places to eat and stay for free too." Although he knew that Lin Li's Tower of Dusk was operating well in the breezy plains, Mason couldn't imagine how well it was doing. Hence, he didn't really believe in Lin Li's words, and merely thought that Lin Li was trying to give him an out. Hence, he immediately put on a happy face and played along. PSHT, a few magical crystal cannons. How generous. Do you know what magical crystal cannons are like? Do you know how much mana it takes to fire one? Or maybe you just remember such a term and nothing more. Please, before you try to brag, think about your words carefully and run them through your head. How ridiculous. Geroso naturally didn't believe Lin Li's words either. He knew the value of magical crystal cannons. Each one cost more than 10,000 gold coins, yet Lin Li generously offered to send them a few. He thought, only idiots would believe such nonsense. "Oh, right," said Lin Li, who didn't get angry at Geroso's mockery, and instead acted like he suddenly remembered something. He said to Mason, "I almost forgot. There's not much of a gathering place for magical beasts on your side, so it's not easy for you to get some magical crystals. How about this? Apart from the magical crystal cannons, I'll get my people to send you some magical crystals as well. Each magical crystal cannon needs a magical crystal of at least level 10 to be activated. In order to deal with the pirates, 100 level 15 ones should be enough. However, it's inevitable that you'll have to deal with other people with sinister intentions in the future, so I'll just give you 500 of them. Ah, Mason opened his mouth wide and found it hard to continue playing along. How many gold coins does each level 15 magical crystal cost? 100 magical crystals, 500. Why can't I calculate anymore? From the moment he entered the side hall, Jeroso had been observing Lin Li's strength, but he did not detect any obvious magical waves. Hence, he reckoned that Lin Li was just a student following his teacher to gain experience. He usually could not be bothered to care about such insignificant people, but seeing how callous and boastful Lin Li was when insulting him, he finally couldn't take it any longer. Jeroso slapped the table and stood up, pointing at Lin Li with one hand and raising his chin. He hollered, "Who do you think you are? Do you know where you are? Do you think something like you is fit to enter? I don't care how you got in here, but you'd better get lost immediately. Don't make me call someone to throw you out." However, Jeroso didn't get any response. Lin Li did not even bother turning around. He smiled and said to Mason, "Forget it, Mason, stop counting. Magical crystals are sold at a pretty high price in the market, but it's nothing over at our side. They can easily be obtained by killing magical beasts." "It's settled then. Remember to inform President Joey I'm talking to you. Who is your teacher? I will see which person is so unruly as to bring any Tom, Dick, and Harry here." Jeroso was filled with rage after seeing that Lin Li had ignored him and continued to brag. He even couldn't help himself anymore and was about to go up and teach him a lesson. However, before Jeroso could do anything, he suddenly felt his body stiffen without warning, as if all of his mana was instantly frozen. He then completely lost control of his body. What is going on? Boundless fear drowned Rog immediately, as he had never experienced something like this before. His body seemed to no longer belong to him, and it was as if he couldn't move a finger at all. At this moment, Lin Li also stood up, but without looking at Jeroso, he said to Mason and Oren, "Let's go chat in another place lest we get our mood affected." Mason and Oren were originally wondering why Jeroso, who had always been arrogant, suddenly fell silent. At this moment, hearing Lin Li's words, they finally understood that it had to be something that their former roommate had done to Jeroso. Rumor had it that he had already entered the legendary realm, and they reckoned that that was probably the means of a legendary mage. As the three of them continued to chat, they walked out of the side hall, leaving the stiffened Jeroso behind. Seeing that the three of them had left, he felt like he was on the verge of collapse, because he couldn't control his body, and was unable to do anything. Lin Li, Mason, and Oren were not specially looking for a venue. They simply found a quiet corner in the hall, and continued to talk about the events that happened to each of them over the years. Not long later, Aldwin and the rest looked for them, and informed Lin Li that the regular meeting was about to begin soon. Mason and Oren were sent to study in the Supreme Council's library by their respective teachers. Under Aldwin's lead, Lin Li followed the crowd towards the venue where the regular meeting was held. At this moment, the people who were originally in the hall followed suit as well. They walked towards the main venue, while some younger disciples walked out of the hall, probably heading to the library to study. Everyone in the hall left in just a minute or two. The hall that was initially bustling with activity and filled with people who were talking to each other softly quieted down as well. No one noticed a young man who was standing still with horror in his eyes in one of the side halls. The venue for the regular meeting of the Supreme Council was an oval-shaped space, where the seats were also arranged in the shape of an oval, with the first layer starting at the boundaries. Every seat was spacious, and they were all a certain distance away from each other. There was a counselor's name tag on every table. When Lin Li arrived, there were already quite a few people seated inside. Opposite the exit, the chairman Andoin and the deputy chairman Rosen had already taken their seats, and on either side of them were the seats reserved for the high-ranking counselors. As the president of the Alana Guild of Magic, who had contributed greatly during the exploration of Osric's mausoleum, Aldwin was seated beside Andoin. Clearly, he was second only to the chairman and deputy chairman in terms of position. After bringing Lin Li and the rest into the venue, Aldwin spoke to a few people and headed to his own seat. Lin Li, Macklin, Joey, and Honor, who were only ordinary counselors for now, were seated separately. Lin Li, the new counselor, was seated the furthest away from the center. After all the counselors had arrived and taken their seats, the meeting finally began, and the first topic to be discussed gave Lin Li, the first-timer and newly minted counselor, a great shock. The situation on the border of the Felon Kingdom and the Leaden Kingdom has recently become increasingly tense, and conflicts have been occurring from time to time. Counselors, I would like you to voice your opinions and discuss the attitude that the Supreme Council should assume regarding the potential war between the two nations in the future. After talking about the topic for discussion during the regular meeting, Anduin returned to his seat and waited for the people to speak. As soon as Anduin returned to his seat, someone gestured and requested to speak. Upon permission, that counselor stood up, looked around the room, and said in a low voice, "There's something that I believe everyone here should have experienced. The magical talents you have favored and had high hopes for often stagnate and get stuck in a bottleneck when they reach a certain stage. It's as if their talent has disappeared overnight, and they've become utterly ordinary, bringing us great disappointment." Seeing that the counselors were all nodding slightly, the counselor who spoke also looked more confident, and he gradually raised his voice. He continued, "The reason for this is that Anral has been peaceful for far too long, preventing the young mages from getting enough experience. Hence, they lack the courage and bravery to face difficulties. Only by braving tumultuous wars and going through life and death situations can they know how insignificant the difficulties they currently face really are. Hence, I believe that we must not only allow the war to go on, we also have to push for it to happen and make it erupt with intensity. This will allow the young mages to gain enough experience." That counselor expressed his opinion before turning to look at the reactions of the counselors around him. He finally bowed to Anduin and resumed his seat. The counselor's perspective somewhat made sense, as humans would only unleash their greatest potential when they were on the brink of death. That was a well-known fact. Besides, there were many examples in this world where people risked their lives to break through bottlenecks and succeeded in the end. Hence, the war could indeed act as a catalyst. However, not everyone would agree with him. Shortly after that counselor sat down, someone stood up and hostilely retorted, "That's nonsense. You only see the trials and tribulations that wars put people through, but you fail to see how much damage and destruction wars can cause. It is true that many historical talents have emerged from those wars, but many outstanding talents have fallen as well. Have you counted how many died before they even achieved anything? I can tell you that the losses will definitely outweigh the gains." Another counselor who supported the war immediately interjected, "Since they have been eliminated by war, they cannot be called talents. The power of magic has to be comprehended through war. Without war." Lin Li sat on the seat at the back and listened to the incessant conflict between the hundreds of counselors. He could not help but be emotional. It was no wonder that everyone said that the Supreme Council could decide the fate of the world of Anral. It was truly not an exaggeration at all. Regardless of who was right or wrong, manipulating a war didn't seem to be a problem for them. They could either let it happen or prevent it from happening. The counselors belonging to the two schools of thought, pro-war and anti-war, began taking turns to speak, and a heated debate soon took place, while Lin Li sat in the corner without saying a word. Such a meeting was fresh to him at first, but he gradually began to feel a little sleepy. They spent an entire day discussing that topic. Even at the end of the discussion, Lin Li wasn't even sure if they had reached a consensus or not. After the meeting ended, Lin Li, who was sitting at the end, was the first to leave. He stood by the entrance for a while, and Macklin and the rest exited as well. Due to the fact that Aldwin was a high-ranking counselor, he had to stay behind with the others to continue discussing the topic just now so as to reach a final decision. At another exit that was not far from Lin Li, Macklin and the rest, a middle-aged mage who was in his 50s walked out. As soon as he did, an archmage who was in charge of maintaining order at the venue inched forward to tell him a few words softly. "What? Someone has the audacity to take action here." A middle-aged mage was shocked, but then thought that it was not appropriate to shout here. He lowered his voice again, and quickly told the person, "Hurry, take me there." The archmage who had come to report the news led the way, and advised, "Counselor Lettings, you need not worry too much. Geroso didn't get hurt. He's just restrained by mana shackle." Before the meeting began, Lettings saw that his student Geroso didn't look for him, and he thought that he had gone to study in the library. To his surprise, he found out after the meeting ended that Geroso had been restrained by mana shackle, and had been trapped in a side room for the entire day. Although Lettings knew that mana shackle wouldn't cause too much damage, the fact that his student had somehow gotten confined for a day was tantamount to a slap on his face. The person who managed to use mana shackle to trap a level 19 archmage for an entire day was definitely at least in the legendary level. That was the reason for Lettings' anger. Since that person had legendary level abilities, he had to be a member of the council. Why couldn't he have gone to Lettings to settle the matter instead of making things hard for a junior? Soon, Lettings arrived in the side hall, and saw his student Geroso, who had been restrained for a whole day. At the sight of his teacher, Geroso almost burst into tears. He was conscious, but was unable to control his body. He felt like he was in a nightmare that he couldn't wake up from for the entire day. Fortunately, Lin Li didn't use much power to confine Geroso, hence, Lettings could release him quickly. Suppressing his anger, he questioned, "Geroso, Who did this to you? With the assistance of the people beside him, Jiroso, whose body had stiffened, took a seat on a chair, and finally prevented himself from embarrassing himself in front of others. He said in a shaky voice, It's someone who was with Mason and Oren. I've never seen him before. As soon as he heard Jiroso mention Mason and Oren, Lettings immediately knew the possible cause of the matter. After all, Jiroso had always been targeting Mason and Oren. However, that did not mean that Lettings forgave that person who did that to his student. Jiroso said that he had never seen that person before. It was not the first time Lettings had brought his student to the regular meeting, but the counselors did not know each other too well. However, even then, it wasn't to the extent where Jiroso had never seen any of them before. Could it be a new counselor? He had no idea, because he was too focused on the discussion about the war during the meeting, so he did not notice any fresh face. Lettings saw the archmage who led him there. Since they were in charge of maintaining order, he reckoned that he should know something. Thus, he asked Begena, is there a new counselor who attended the meeting today? Well, it seems so, Begena answered after thinking about it for a while. There were 2 new counselors at the meeting today. One was President Joey of the Chevan City Guild of Magic. The other was President Fulik of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, Tower of Dusk. Lettings' eyes lit up. The useless Joey was only a level 19 archmage, who had no means to confine his disciple at all. Since President Fulik of the Tower of Dusk was already a legendary mage, he could be the culprit. Jiroso finally knew that the person he originally didn't care about was the culprit, who had crippled his brother in the first place. What? Fulik? He's Fulik. Teacher, I'm sure that the one who did it to me. However, before Jiroso could finish speaking, Lettings hollered, shut up. President Fulik is the president of a guild of magic and a newly promoted counselor of the Supreme Council. How could he attack a junior like you? Leave with me. Don't embarrass me here. As he said that, he glanced at the archmage beside him, Begena. Jiroso felt a little aggrieved at first, but after catching his teacher's hint, he immediately understood something. He got up and obediently followed his teacher out. After the two left, Begena shook his head in amusement, and turned around to return to the venue like nothing had happened. Jiroso followed his teacher out. Seeing that there was no one around, he couldn't help but say, Teacher, it must be that Fulik. He and Mason and Oren were roommates back then. They shared a close relationship. My younger brother Gryffindor was crippled by him. He must be thinking of crippling me too. After he confined me, he called me garbage, and said that I had a useless teacher. His comments were nasty. Even if Jiroso did not try to sow discord, Lettings wouldn't let the matter rest just like that. A newly minted counselor wasn't enough to make him feel wary. Regardless of the reason, his student had been bullied, and if he did not stand up for him, others would laugh their heads off. He's just a new counselor, yet he has the audacity to be so arrogant. Go find out where he lives. He's asking to be stripped of his position as a counselor. Lettings dared to say those words, definitely not because he was just saving face in front of his student, but rather because he was absolutely confident. A counselor of the Supreme Council might seem like a big shot to others, but Lettings, who was also a counselor, knew that it didn't mean anything at all. There were hundreds of counselors in the entire council, and everyone's identity was the same. It was a competition of connections. What kind of remarkable connections could a newly minted counselor have made? Although Joey of the Chevan City Guild of Magic was also a new member, he had been a president for years, and he at least had 3 or 5 close friends. Lettings felt that since Lin Li was the president of a newly established guild of magic in a shabby place like the Breezy Plains, Lin Li wouldn't have any connections, as he wouldn't have the chance to interact with the other guilds of magic. However, Lettings was different. He had been a counselor for so many years, and many other counselors had to give him face. Besides, in the Supreme Council, the chairman, deputy chairman, and the 8 high-ranking counselors were the ones who truly held the highest power. He had good ties with a few high-ranking counselors, and he could even speak to Deputy Chairman Rosen through them. Hence, in Lettings' opinion, it was simply too easy to deal with a new counselor with his connections. He felt that he might just make Lin Li pack his bags and scram back to the Breezy Plains. When that happened, Lin Li would be stripped of his position as counselor and subjected to his torture. He would then let him know the consequences of offending him. Hearing that his teacher asked him to find out where Lin Li lived, Jiroso knew that he would definitely get his revenge. He couldn't help but smile smugly, and he even forgot the pain he felt after being physically confined for a day for a moment. He didn't think as much as Lettings, but he knew that his teacher was rather authoritative in the Supreme Council, and had high power. Hence, he immediately responded, and proceeded to investigate, ignoring the soreness of his achy muscles. Watching his student leave, the corners of Lettings' lips were slightly raised, and there was a look of pride on his face. Actually, getting revenge was not the most important. The most important thing was the big fat piece of meat that was the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. At first, no one thought that someone would be able to gain a stable footing in the Breezy Plains, hence, They ignored the production value of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. By the time they noticed, it was almost impossible to intervene again, unless they could find a reason to get rid of that young president. It was a good opportunity for Lettings now. If the other party knew any better, he would offer some profits that would satisfy him. However, if he wasn't sensible enough, Lettings would collude with other counselors and high-ranking counselors to divide the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic. After chatting with Macklin and the rest for a while, Lin Li arrived at the residence that the Supreme Council had arranged for him, under the lead of an archmage. After all, he was a member of the Supreme Council, and although it was only a temporary resting place, the environment was rather pleasant. However, Lin Li didn't care much about the environment. After the archmage left, he returned to his room and took out the Book of Eternity. Although he had just attended a meeting that could be considered one that decided the fate of Anril, Lin Li didn't think too much of it. To him, increasing his strength quickly was much more important. After he did that, he would go seal the spacetime rift Garesco had mentioned. War was nothing compared to that. Lin Li read the Book of Eternity with no distractions, but at some point, he vaguely heard someone yelling outside his room. He put the book down to listen carefully, only to realize that the person was calling him. "Fulik, come out." Garesco stood outside the room with a smug expression, entirely forgetting how much he had regretted messing with the wrong person when he had been restrained. Of course, it was not that he didn't learn his lesson at all. At least now he knew that he ought to stand far away from Lin Li's room. The door opened silently. However, Garesco immediately got goosebumps. When he saw Lin Li appearing at the door, he broke out in a cold sweat, but at the thought of his teacher standing up for him soon, he immediately mustered up the courage and snapped, "Don't be too cocky, I'm telling you. My teacher will soon come looking for you. You are in big trouble, and there will be a time when you cry." After saying that, Garesco turned around and left like he was fleeing, without even waiting for Lin Li to respond. Although he had his teacher to support him, and was sure that Lin Li would have a terrible end, Lin Li was still stronger than him. After all, he could easily confine Garesco again. If Lin Li were to go hard against him, after hearing the news, he would be the unlucky one. Seeing that Garesco had scurried away, Lin Li felt a little puzzled, but he didn't think much. Instead, he turned around and returned to his room to read the Book of Eternity. The Sky Garden was still in the normal world. It was affected by the changes in the world even though it was hovering in the air. Soon, the sky darkened, and bright magic lamps illuminated the streets and alleys of the Sky Garden. Lettings didn't immediately put the connections he had to use, and instead followed Lin Li out according to the news given by Garesco. He was very familiar with the surroundings because he had also rested in such a place during breaks in between regular meetings, when he first joined the Supreme Council. Hence, Lettings didn't have to worry much. Clearly, Lin Li didn't have any powerful backer. Otherwise, even a newly minted counselor would not be arranged to live at such a place. Reaching the door, Lettings was all ready to push the door and enter. However, before his hand even landed on the door, he heard some voices talking inside the room. It seemed that Lin Li wasn't the only one there, and he vaguely felt that one of the voices was somewhat familiar. In order to be cautious, Lettings retracted his hand and moved away from the door, inching towards the other side of the room. Not only would he not arouse suspicion in those who passed by, he could also hear the voices inside. As soon as he tried to listen, he heard sounds of a conversation coming out from the room again. The voice was a little clearer, but after he heard it, his heart sank a little. It was no wonder he found the voices familiar. They belonged to Aldwin and Macklin. Lettings had been a counselor for many years, and he often had dealings with the Alana Guild of Magic. Hence, he could still identify the voices of Aldwin and Macklin. At this moment, Lettings couldn't help but feel fortunate and thankful that he had been cautious. Had he barged in to question Lin Li recklessly and run into the two of them, the situation would have been awkward. However, why are they here at this moment? Has Fulik gotten himself acquainted with these two so soon? Lettings couldn't stop thinking about it. Aldwin was a true high-ranking counselor of the Supreme Council, who was second only to the chairman and deputy chairman. Besides, he was the president of a guild of magic. No matter what, he couldn't afford to provoke him. Although it had been a short period of time since Macklin had joined the Supreme Council, he had contributed greatly, and his power had already reached the legendary realm. The position of a counselor was just a temporary springboard, and he might become a high-ranking counselor sometime soon. More importantly, Macklin was known to have a bad temper, and he might be tougher to deal with than Aldwin. However, Lettings did not want to give up just like that. He had come in a moment of anger, and if he were to go back cowardly, what would his student think of him? Besides, the wealth of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic was too tempting. If he could get some of their wealth for his new Crescent City Guild of Magic, it would be of great help to the development of his Guild of Magic. Yes, getting a small slice of the pie would be enough. If he pocketed everything, others would be jealous of him. With those thoughts, Lettings decided to stay and listen to find out the relationship between them. At this moment, Lin Li was talking to Aldwin and Macklin about the things they had done after exploring Osric's mausoleum in the room. They also talked about some matters regarding the cooperation between the two guilds of magic. Due to the fact that there was nothing to hide, they did not deliberately keep their volume down, nor care if anyone was eavesdropping on them. When it came to the experience of exploring Osric's mausoleum, Aldwin and Macklin thanked Lin Li emotionally. It was not only because Lin Li managed to resolve Osric's perfect body, but also because the mages of the Alana Guild of Magic would have long been wiped out without Lin Li along the way, and they might not have been able to even make it to the last floor. However, Lin Li didn't say anything more on that topic. He simply smiled at the two of them and dropped the subject. After all, he had struck a fortune during that exploration. Not only did he obtain the core of the Eternal Furnace, he also managed to conscript a guru of alchemy. After that, the three of them talked about cooperation, from magical crystals to magical equipment and so on. Due to the fact that they were only talking about their intentions at first, they didn't go into too much detail. However, if they were to lay all their cards on the table, it would take a long time to discuss. The three of them were chatting and laughing leisurely in the room, appearing rather close. Lettings, who was eavesdropping outside, felt like his heart was gradually freezing. Putting aside the relationship of the trio, the fact that they had a cooperation going on made him feel that the matter was tricky. No matter what, since Aldwin and Macklin were inside, Lettings already had no intention of intruding to seek justice. It seemed that he could only go back and talk to the rest about it. If he were to work with the other high-ranking counselors, there might be some hope for the matter. However, just as Lettings was about to leave, he heard the sound of footsteps coming again, and he turned around to take a look, only to see that it was the chairman Andoin, giving him a great shock. "Hey, Lettings, why are you still standing here? Are you here to see Fulik?" Andoin knew that Lettings did not stay there, and so questioned him in puzzlement. However, he did not think much of it. Andoin's question made Lettings feel so shocked that he nearly started, and couldn't control the cold sweat from breaking out on his body. It seemed to have penetrated his clothes. If it weren't for the black robe he was wearing, and the obscurity provided by the night, others would probably have seen him being drenched in sweat. Lettings did not know what Andoin had come to do, nor did he know what relationship he had with Fulik, but he dared not question him at all. He frantically found a random excuse, and said, "I'm waiting for someone." "Yes, I'm waiting for someone. You don't have to worry about me. You're waiting for someone here," Andoin muttered, but he did not suspect anything. He went straight to Lin Li's door and entered. He said, "Fulik, you rascal, you're here, and yet you didn't come to see me. You actually made me come to you. I knew you were busy, but I didn't expect you to be so eager to see me." "I'm so ashamed," Lin Li answered smilingly. Although he seemed apologetic, it didn't sound sincere. "I'm eager to see you." "Rascal, don't think so highly of yourself," Andoin teased. He wasn't offended by Lin Li's attitude. He responded to Aldwin's and Macklin's greetings, after which he said, "I just came to inform you about something." Listening to the conversation between Andoin and Lin Li, Lettings was overwhelmed with fear, and he stood rooted to the ground. Regardless of what their relationship was, he could tell from their conversation that it was definitely not ordinary. He is Andoin, the chairman of the council, who is second only to the three arbitrators. Who is Fulik, and how did he get involved with Chairman Andoin? Damn it, that bastard Jeroso almost caused me to die. Had I really barged in to question Fulik? At the thought of the dire consequences, Lettings shuddered, and realized that even the high-ranking counselors would not be able to save him if that were to happen. However, the people inside the room didn't know that they were just talking, yet someone outside was already on the verge of breaking down. Lin Li arranged for Andoin to sit on the chair, after which he smilingly said, "What's the big deal? Why did you have to come all the way here personally? You could have just gotten someone to relay the message, and I would have to run back to see you obediently." "Get someone to relay the message? I'm the messenger. Why would I get another one?" Andoin waved his hands nonchalantly. Although he was the chairman of the Supreme Council, he was not the type to put on airs. Rosen might have done the opposite if it were him. Upon hearing that, Lin Li, Aldwin and Macklin were all slightly shocked. Lin Li curiously asked, "It's degrading enough for you to be a messenger. Who made you relay a message? Who else can task me with errands?" "Those three above me, of course," Andoin said while pointing upwards. Of course. Once he said that, Lin Li understood as well. In the Supreme Council, apart from the three arbitrators, no one else could give Andoin any tasks. Why don't we go back first?" Knowing that Andoin was relaying a message on behalf of the three arbitrators, Macklin and Aldwin decided to leave even though they did not know what they were going to talk about. "No need," Andoin said while waving his hands. He then said to Lin Li, "The 3 arbitrators are asking to see you tomorrow. They have something important to discuss with you." Discuss. Aldwin and Macklin knew of the relationship between Andoin and Lin Li, hence, they were not shocked about their behavior. Actually, the 3 arbitrators asking to see Lin Li was not that surprising, either. Anyway, Apophis, Maegard, and Chris had previously met Lin Li separately. They were just going to meet him together this time. However, what did they have to discuss? How could the word, discuss, be used here? For a moment, Aldwin and Macklin were somewhat petrified. In the entire world of Anral, the only person who was qualified to discuss anything with the 3 arbitrators was probably a figure like Pope Rosario of the Brilliant Shrine. Seeing their reaction, Andoin pursed his lips, but he did not make fun of them, because he'd reacted the same way when he heard that the arbitrators wanted him to relay the message. "Alright, I've relayed the message. I still have to go back to prepare for the meeting tomorrow. I won't chat with you any further." Although Andoin still wanted to chat with Lin Li and dig up some more information about pharmaceutics, he was a chairman who had endless things to do. Actually, Lin Li was shocked as well. Although he had already entered the sanctuary realm, he clearly still could, not compared to the 3 arbitrators. Did he really qualify to use the word, discuss? Upon hearing that Andoin was about to leave, Lin Li didn't think too much of it, and simply stood up to walk Andoin out. As for Aldwin and Macklin, Andoin had long left by the time they reacted and followed him out. After Andoin left Lin Li's room, and was about to return to the Eternal Tower, he saw Lettings who was standing stiffly beside the room. Hence, he asked Lettings, "Is the person you're waiting for not here yet?" "Ah, no, it's not that. I think he must be held up by something. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm going back now," said Lettings, who got a great shock after hearing Andoin's question. He suddenly broke out in a cold sweat, and spluttered while trying to give an explanation. Without waiting for Andoin to say anything, he simply lowered his head and left. "Strange. Am I that frightening?" Andoin asked, stroking his chin in bafflement while watching Lettings who seemed to be fleeing in panic. After Lin Li sent Andoin away, Aldwin and Macklin were no longer in the mood to continue their conversation, so they both took their leave as well. Lin Li sent the 2 of them away as well, and continued to look up at the night sky. He could not help but be puzzled as he wondered, didn't that person say that someone is going to find me and create trouble? It's already so late, but he hasn't showed up yet. If he still doesn't appear, I'm going to go to sleep. At this time, however, the person who Lin Li was waiting for did not dare to look back at all. It was as if there were numerous evil demons chasing him. Of course, along the way, Lettings had cursed his incompetent student, who was a letdown. He thought, "Damn it, aren't you harming me? Of all people, why do you have to mess with such a powerful person?" Fortunately, I'm cautious enough, or else the efforts of my life would have gone in vain because of that incompetent student. "Teacher, you're back. You've taught that kid a lesson, right?" Seeing that his teacher had returned, Jeroso was extremely excited, and didn't even notice the expression on his teacher's face as he simply rushed forward to ask about the outcome. "Pat." Lettings was infuriated. Seeing that Jeroso still dared to ask him about it, Lettings immediately slapped him before cursing. "Are you trying to harm me? Of all people, why did you provoke him? Is he someone you can provoke?" "Teacher, you." Jeroso was dumbfounded after getting slapped. Looking at his teacher, who was infuriated, he pursed his lips and did not dare to ask for the reason. "Don't call me teacher. Being your teacher will cause me to die sooner or later. Do you know who he is?" Even Aldwin can't put on any airs around him, and Counselor Andoin doesn't treat him like an outsider. "Do you think I'm an arbitrator? Don't create trouble before you find out his background." The more Lettings thought about it, the more enraged he got. Even though he usually barely used foul language, he was cursing his heart out at Jeroso now. Finally, his teacher stopped scolding him, but Jeroso dared not utter a single word. He covered his face with one hand and walked out of his teacher's room. He only dared to reveal a resentful expression after walking far away. He rubbed his face and thought to himself in anger, "How would I know that that kid would have such a high status? Forget it if it's just Aldwin. Why did Counselor Andoin get involved with him too? What should I do? Am I supposed not to take revenge?" Jeroso was feeling indignant, but there was nothing he could do as Lin Li had the backing of the chairman. He couldn't get an arbitrator to support him, could he? All of a sudden, Jeroso's eyes lit up, and he thought about the fact that his younger brother's teacher was the deputy chairman, Rosen. He heard that Rosen and Andoin had always been at odds, and the 2 of them often fought at the meetings. That at least meant that Rosen was not afraid of Andoin. If Rosen were to find out that the person who crippled his student was in the Sky Garden, he would probably step in to deal with Flick. The more Jeroso thought about it, the more hope he had, and his frustration was suddenly swept away. He rubbed his face, recalling his experience of visiting the deputy chairman Rosen in the past. He then walked towards the deputy chairman's residence, according to his memory without hesitation. I didn't expect that rascal to have become a counselor so quickly. We must speed up the plan, otherwise I'm afraid things will get out of control sooner or later. Rosen was seated with a sullen expression, as he continuously tapped his fingers against the table, obviously quite irritated at this point. At this moment, a middle-aged magician in his 40s who had curly brown hair entered. He was tall and burly, and was emitting a powerful legendary-level magical wave. Upon sight of Rosen, he appeared extremely respectful, and he bowed slightly. "Sir, you asked to see me in the middle of the night. What can I help you with?" Upon sight of Hubert, Rosen's face eased up a little, and he pointed to a chair beside him. He said, "Come, take a seat. I asked you to come over because I am preparing to propose a motion to the Supreme Council tomorrow." Hubert had been following Rosen for many years, and he managed to become a high counselor, all thanks to Rosen's support and nurturing. Hubert was naturally very familiar with Rosen's habits, hence, after hearing his words, he immediately understood that the proposal was probably not simple. If it was an ordinary proposal, Rosen wouldn't have to appear in person at all, as it would be usually handed over to the reliable counselors under him. It was because Rosen was confident enough that he would still be able to get those proposals accepted smoothly even if he didn't use his position as deputy chairman. Since he was using his identity as deputy chairman to raise the proposal, it meant that the motion probably involved one of two kinds of issues. One was that the proposal might not be in the interest of the majority of the councillors, so he had to push for it using his identity. Another could be that the proposal involved the chairman, Andoin, and was highly likely to be opposed by him. "If there is anything I can do to help, please feel free to let me know." Hubert did not ask any questions, and instead directly showed his support for Rosen. Hubert's reply made the expression on Rosen's face ease up, and he nodded secretly before saying, "You should be familiar with the situation in Tower of Dusk, which is also the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic." "Yes," Hubert answered. It seemed that the proposal really had something to do with Chairman Andoin. As Rosen's close confidant, Hubert naturally already knew that the young president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic was a student of Chairman Andoin. He also knew that the young president, Flick, managed to rise to his position because he had defeated Rosen's student Gryffindor during the magic trial. The Breezy Plains Guild of Magic has a mine that is currently the largest reserve found in the world of Anril. The Supreme Council's requirements in this aspect are almost supplied by them. However, what they've provided is actually only a quarter of what they produce, Rosen said monotonously without revealing any emotion. However, Hubert knew that Rosen must have been full of resentment. If it weren't for the appearance of Flick, Rosen's student, Gryffindor, would have probably been the current president of the Breezy Plains Guild of Magic, which also meant that Rosen would own it. However, the matter concerned the chairman Andoin, and Hubert also knew that it definitely wouldn't be easy to handle the matter. Hence, he cautiously asked, "Do you mean that you want to ask them to increase their supply?" Rosen shook his head smilingly, and said, "No, not at all. In my proposal, I'm going to ask them to hand over the ownership of the Terra Mine to the Supreme Council. If the motion passes, I'll make you the administrator." Upon hearing that, Hubert couldn't help but gasp. Rosen's got a huge appetite this time, so much that it was beyond his imagination. The Terra Mithril had always been known as a magical treasure, and the lifeline that supported the development of magical civilization. Its value was definitely not something that could be measured by money. After smelting its ore, one would be able to obtain precious Terra Mithril, which was one of the most important and indispensable materials in high-grade magical equipment. It wasn't that the Terra Mithril could provide any extra power for the high-grade magical equipment, but rather that there would be no high-grade magical equipment without Terra Mithril. Besides, Terra Mithril could also greatly increase the stability of mana. Hence, it was in great demand in all kinds of magic experiments. For mages, studying magic was not as simple as reading books about magic, reciting a few magic spells, and then meditating with their eyes closed. In order to understand the power of the magical elements, mages would usually have to conduct some magic experiments and gain experience, which would be far more intuitive and profound than what they would get from reading books about magic. One of the more important uses of magic experiments was to allow mages to study and understand unknown magical domains, and it could be said that almost all the results of the experiments had an incomparable role in promoting the development of magic civilization in Anril. Without the existence of the Terra Mithril, the world's magical civilization might be come to a complete halt by the time humans took over. After all, humans didn't have a bloodline as powerful as the High Elves, and if they wanted to master magic, they would have to continuously try to grasp the concepts through conducting experiments. As long as the Terra Mithril was present, humans would be able to create new power and thrive in the field of magic. Only then could the magic civilization of humans develop beyond the high elves. Originally, the production of terra mithril and anril was very low, and it was basically found as rare complementary minerals and precious ores and mines. Even then, the reserves were extremely low, and it didn't take long for them to be mined. Actually, Lin Li discovered the terra mine in the Tower of Dusk's land after some exploration 2 years ago. Not to forget, he also had master-level attainments in finding ores. After the terra mine was discovered, Lin Li did not announce it to the world. Otherwise, given the strength of the Tower of Dusk back then, the other forces of the breezy plains would have long wiped them out. In order to get a backer in case the news leaked out and caused big trouble for the Tower of Dusk, Lin Li had reported the mine's existence to the Supreme Council. In fact, the scale of the Tower of Dusk's mining of the terra mine had never been large, and the share that he supplied to the Supreme Council was actually already half of the production at that time. After all, the Tower of Dusk did not have the ability to digest more terra mines at that time. It was only after Lin Li returned from the Spacetime Rift and gained some insight into the Sanctuary Realm power that he began to expand the scale of mining of the terra mine. Hence, as the production increased, the share supplied to the Supreme Council became a quarter of the Tower of Dusk's production. In fact, given the value of the terra mine, the amount that the Tower of Dusk was currently supplying to the Supreme Council was already considered a huge loss. Hence, Hubert had only asked Rosen if he wanted to propose an increase in supply, but he did not expect Rosen to have such a great appetite. He actually wanted to strip the Tower of Dusk of the rights to the mine. However, on second thought, Hubert also understood that it was not unreasonable for Rosen to come to that decision. Even if he only asked the Tower of Dusk to increase the supply, the young president of the Tower of Dusk might not agree to it happily. Chairman Andorn definitely wouldn't sit back and let the proposal pass either. Besides, simply expanding the supply wouldn't benefit Rosen that much. Since he was bent on fighting Andorn, he would have to maximize his interests. If he lost, there would be nothing he could say, but if he won, the gains would be massive. Besides, Hubert just heard very clearly that Rosen was planning to let him manage the terra mine after the proposal was passed, which was definitely going to benefit him. Putting aside the profit that he could gain by keeping some terra mithril, even if he were to give all the terra mithril obtained from mining and smelting to the Supreme Council, he would be paid handsomely for it. The terra mine did not produce only terra mithril, but also more precious and rare gems. An example would be the unique terra crystal that contained the purest mana and could be used by any mage. There was no need for conversion at all, because there would be no waste during the extraction process. It was simply comparable to the effect of a mage meditating for several or 10-odd years. Besides, due to the terra mithril's property of enhancing magical stability, the quality of the other accompanying gems was also greatly superior to that of gems in other ores. The Supreme Council mainly needed terra mithril, and as long as he could guarantee its supply, there was nothing anyone could say about it. It wasn't that the Supreme Council despised the high-grade complementary gems, but rather that they could not be calculated easily like terra mithril, and the Supreme Council didn't need them anyway. Hence, it would be up to the person in charge to do whatever he wanted with them. At the thought of such great benefits, Hubert's heart raced. However, he wasn't overwhelmed, and after calming down a little, he said, "Once we raise this proposal, it will definitely be strongly opposed by Chairman Andorn. With the voting power we can now hold, I'm afraid it won't be easy to get this proposal passed." It was extremely difficult. If Rosen could really allow the proposal to pass easily, he would no longer have to be the deputy chairman, and could easily replace Andorn as the chairman of the Supreme Council. Rosen was naturally aware of the problem, but if he missed that opportunity and allowed Lin Li to gain a strong footing, it would be even more difficult for the proposal to be passed in the future. Hence, he told Hubert, "It's indeed not going to be easy. With your ability, how many votes do you think we can get tomorrow?" Hubert was a high-ranking member of the Supreme Council, who was second only to Aldwin. He had a network of connections too. He contemplated for a moment the names of the councillors he was close to, and considered the ties he had with those acquaintances he might be able to win over. In the end, he gave Rosen a number. They could expect 19 votes, which excluded the people Rosen could influence. However, his answer did not satisfy Rosen, who shook his head slightly and said, "That's not enough to push for the proposal. Even with the votes of the neutral ones, whom we might win over, it won't be enough. If I promise them some benefits that could be achieved after the proposal is passed, I can win the support of 3 more members. However, even then, it's still far short of half of the total number of votes." Hubert was stuck in a spot. After all, he couldn't possibly bribe all the councillors. If things were to go awry and he got exposed, Andorn would definitely find out. He would then lose his position as a high-ranking councillor. Besides, even if he were to bribe them, he would have to pay a high price. How much would it take to get people to stop having scruples because of Anduin's identity as the chairman? After all, the proposal was clearly meant to offend Anduin. No matter how great a benefit that proposal could bring about, it would just be an idealistic daydream if it did not pass through. There was a somber tension in the air in the room, and neither of them spoke again. Only the sound of Rosen continuously tapping the table could be heard clearly. Geroso stood outside the door, and his face turned red with excitement, covering the slap mark. His breathing became uncontrollably rapid. He initially thought that he was extremely unlucky to have offended someone whom he shouldn't have, and ended up getting scolded by his teacher. To his surprise, he was actually lucky because Rosen was already getting ready to deal with Fulik without needing him to request it. Geroso had already arrived, and was originally worried about how he could convince Rosen to stand up for him. To his surprise, he heard the conversation between Rosen and Hubert. He could tell from their conversation that it was no longer as simple as teaching Fulik a lesson. Instead, they were going to take away something important from him. However, after hearing the later part of the conversation, Geroso knew that Rosen and Hubert had encountered a tough problem. If they wanted to push the proposal through, they would have to get the support of at least half of the members of the council. If they did not have the confidence to, they shouldn't raise it at all, as it would only affect Rosen's prestige. Hearing the sudden silence in the room, Geroso panicked because it was an opportunity for him to take revenge. If they were to let it go, he might never get to avenge himself again. He might not even get to raise his head high in front of Mason and Orn again in the future. They merely lacked votes. His teacher was a counselor as well, and had a wide network of connections. He thought that his teacher wouldn't be willing to let this matter go like that, either. Besides, he might even get to build a connection with the deputy chairman. At the thought of that, Geroso felt a sudden urge, and he could no longer care. He reached out and barged into the room before exclaiming with excitement, "Deputy Chairman Rosen, Rosen and Hubert were feeling frustrated about the proposal, and trying to rack their brains when they heard the door being opened, after which a figure scrambled in. Although they were both legendary powerhouses, they were also shocked by the sudden situation. After seeing that it was an archmage, they were incredibly enraged. As the deputy chairman, Rosen was particular about the formalities, and even if Anduin wanted to see him, he would still have to seek permission at the door before entering. That was also the reason they did not arrange for anyone to guard the door when Rosen and Hubert were talking to each other. Rosen could not think of a single person in the entire Supreme Council who would dare to eavesdrop on his conversation. However, the person who did was an archmage. When he saw Geroso who barged in, Rosen's face grew extremely sullen, and before Geroso even said anything substantial, he sternly barked, "Sneaky thing, don't you know any rules at all? This is not a place where you can just barge in." After Rosen's stern chiding, a massive wave of pressure exploded as well, filling the entire room. It was as if the space was frozen and solidified. After Geroso barged in, he was initially filled with excitement, and was about to tell Rosen his purpose of visit. However, his face grew sullen after sensing the mighty pressure. He felt like the sky was about to collapse, and like the dark walls were about to close in on him. What made Geroso feel even more frightened was the fact that he could feel a killing intent coming which seemed to have penetrated deep into his soul from Rosen, leaving him with no doubt that Rosen would really kill him at this moment. Under that pressure, Geroso felt like his spirit was about to collapse, and his legs had turned numb. His body fell to the ground, and he began trembling continuously. He could not care to say anything else. In fact, at this time, even the legendary mage Hubert was frightened by the pressure, let alone an archmage Hubert. However, after sensing the killing intent from Rosen, Hubert dared not delay, either. He frantically said, "Lord, please simmer down and hear his explanation. It won't be too late to deal with him afterwards. Viciat in Velb, and, see, Imferel test Vels." After all, they were in the Sky Garden, and although Rosen was the deputy chairman, it still wouldn't be easy for him to cover his tracks if he were to kill an archmage. Besides, since Geroso barged in instead of telling on them, it meant that he was not from Anduin's side. Of course, Rosen knew that as well, but he was already suffering a headache from the matter regarding the proposal. Yet something like that cropped up next. Anyone in his position would definitely be furious. However, after hearing Hubert's persuasion, Rosen suppressed his anger and looked at Geroso, who was crawling on the ground. He coldly said, "I'll give you a chance to explain, and if you can't satisfy me." At this moment, Geroso felt as if he had just come out of water, and even the place where he was lying down was wet. If it weren't for the fact that Rosen had restrained some of his pressure, he would have really wet his pants at the next moment. Geroso was still lying on the ground, and his body had turned so soft that he couldn't stand up at all. He simply raised his head to look at Rosen. "Yes, Deputy Chairman, it's me. Don't you remember me anymore? Your student Gryffindor is my younger brother." "That's not what I want to hear." By the time Rosen saw Geroso's face, He had remembered who he was, but there was no change in his stern attitude. Back then, Geroso was one of the people recommended to Rosen together with Gryffindor. However, at that time, Rosen could tell that although Geroso had a bit of magical talent, he was by no means one that had potential to grow. Hence, he merely accepted Gryffindor as his student. Rosen was never impressed with people like Geroso, who lacked talent but behaved arrogantly like he was a genius. That had never changed. The bone-penetrating coldness in Rosen's voice made Geroso shiver uncontrollably again. He dared not think of building connections with Rosen anymore. He frantically said, "Deputy Chairman, my teacher is Lettings, a counselor who has a little bit of connections in the council. If you need it, I'm sure my teacher will also be happy to serve you." Upon hearing his words, Rosen's face finally became less austere. At the same time, he also restrained his massive suppressive aura. He calmly said, "Is that so? In that case, how many votes can your teacher get?" The terrifying pressure finally disappeared, and Geroso secretly heaved a sigh of relief. If that were to go on, he would really lose his mind. With the nightmare-like experience, Geroso dared not delay at all. He continued, "We can get the votes of Councillor Kermit, Councillor Kyara, Councillor Sagar." As Geroso said those names, smiles gradually appeared on the faces of both Rosen and Hubert. Previously, they had already counted the votes that they were confident in getting. After adding those names, they immediately had an answer in their hearts. If Geroso could get those councillors to vote for them, like he claimed he could, Rosen's votes would definitely help him win and allow the proposal to pass. If nothing were to go wrong, it would be enough to push the proposal through. Besides, the content of the proposal was in the Supreme Council's favor to begin with. It would merely cause damage to a newly established guild of magic. He believed that the councillors who were in a neutral position and put the interests of the Supreme Council first would definitely be tempted when faced with this proposal. "Good. If you can do this properly, I can forgive you for your impolite behavior. Remember, I want a definitive answer before the meeting commences tomorrow." "Leave," Rosen said coldly before dismissing him with the wave of his hand. In the blink of an eye, it was the next day, and Geroso and a few young mages were gesturing and talking about something outside the library of the Sky Garden of the Supreme Council. The expression on Geroso's face suggested that the matter that took place the previous day did not affect him at all. The several young archmages were following their teachers to the Supreme Council for learning opportunities, and their teachers were the counselors who promised Geroso that they would support Rosen's proposal during the meeting. When Geroso reported the news to Rosen, he could tell from Rosen's tone that Fulik, who had crippled his brother and embarrassed him, would definitely be in trouble after the meeting. Besides, that was not the only thing that Geroso was happy about. This time, his teacher Lettings and the deputy chairman had forged a connection, and he was going to be praised. He might even get to be in charge of the new Crescent City Guild of Magic in the future. It was the most enjoyable thing in life to have an enemy down on his luck while one enjoyed his fortune. How could he not share such a joyful event with someone else? However, sharing it with his friends wasn't fulfilling enough for him. At this moment, Geroso's eyes were glistening. When he looked past the mages in front of him, he recognized the person walking towards the library to be Mason. "Hey, isn't this Mason? Where is that backer of yours?" With a few of his companions, Geroso stopped Mason in his tracks. "Geroso, what's wrong? Haven't you been taught a lesson yesterday? Wasn't it enough?" Mason stopped in his tracks and looked at Geroso and the rest warily. "A lesson? I'm terrified," Geroso retorted sarcastically while shivering in an exaggerated manner. He then raised his chin with a smug face and said, "Let me tell you, that big backer of yours is having a hard time saving himself. It's a pity. You should have asked him for some magical crystals earlier. After today, I'm afraid he won't even be able to pay for a magical crystal." Geroso's words and exaggerated expression immediately caused the archmages to burst into laughter. "I don't know what you're talking about. Move over. I'm going to the library." Mason knew that a bully like Geroso would never dare to be so arrogant after being taught a lesson the day before unless he had someone to support him. Hence, he did not want to continue being embroiled in the matter with Geroso. He simply hurried to the library to warn Lin Li, whom he had agreed to meet beforehand. Geroso hadn't had enough, and obviously wouldn't let Mason leave just like that. With a look of disdain, he continued, "To the library. Garbage like you is only going to be a waste of space there. There won't be any use in your memorizing more incantations. I think you'd better scurry back to your village and become a fisherman." "Ha ha ha ha." Mason's face reddened. The blood vessels on his temples were bulging, and his fists were clenched so tightly that his body trembled slightly. He tried his best to suppress his anger, and he yelled, "Geroso, don't go overboard. Don't think that I'm really scared of you. Is that so? I wonder who the person always being beaten down by me is. You're just a piece of garbage, who's only worthy of hiding behind Fulik. What else can you do? You're such a disgrace to mages." Geroso was pleased with the way Mason was behaving, and he felt like he had finally gotten some interest back from the torment he suffered the day before. Mason, do something. You are actually tolerating this. You call yourself a man. Ha! He's not fit to fight Brother Jeroso. Previously, he was blasted away by a gas blast spell, and couldn't get up for a long time. That was hilarious.
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.